Chapter 1. Certain things in life are bound to make you wonder how much of your destiny is due to fate and how much is the product of chance. For my family, the U.S. Army was a catalyst. In 1943, the world was at war, and my father, Walter Alden, was drafted into the Army. My mother, Jo Spencer, enlisted in the Women's Army Corps, and they were both posted at Fort Stewart, Georgia. 2 years after meeting at the base service station one fateful day, they married. 11 months later, they had my brother Mike, and 5 years later, my sister Rosemary was born. My dad decided on a career in the military, and in 1951 they settled in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was home to many great musical talents, but in the mid-1950s, Elvis Presley had begun to put our city on the map for millions around the world. In 1955, the year my sister Terry was born, my family was living in an apartment building on Getwell Road. Unaware that Elvis lived about 5 blocks away, my brother was riding his bike on Stribling Street one day and recognized Elvis in a flatbed truck as he drove up beside him. Elvis smiled at Mike and slowly passed him. Mike followed him to Dunn Avenue until Elvis made a turn and he lost sight of him. My brother later told my parents he probably smiled at me because I was staring at him. Like my brother, most Memphians felt a sense of pride that Elvis shared their home. I was born on November 13, 1956, at the Naval Hospital in Millington, Tennessee, and I would grow up feeling that pride even as a small child. In 1957, my father, now ranked Sergeant First Class, was in public relations and recruiting for the Army. He worked closely with the Memphis Draft Board, notifying and advising individuals that if they enlisted, they would be able to receive special opportunities. Earlier that year, the board had announced that Elvis would probably be drafted. Every branch of the military began making offers, trying to get him to enlist. Hoping to speak with Elvis on the Army's behalf, my dad made a trip to Graceland, Elvis's recently purchased home, only to be told that Elvis was away. Before my father could return to Graceland, he was informed that Elvis had decided not to enlist and would take his chances with the draft. At the end of the year, Elvis received his notice for induction into the U.S. Army. On the morning of March 24, 1958, Elvis arrived with his parents, Gladys and Vernon, at the draft board office located inside the M&M building in downtown Memphis. Elvis and the other recruits being drafted then boarded a bus for physicals at the U.S. Army and Air Force recruiting main station at Kennedy Veterans Hospital. Shortly after arriving, they entered a reception room and sat on chairs lined up in rows behind long tables. In that room, soon-to-be Private Elvis Presley laid eyes on my father for the first time as my dad walked in and said a few words, giving the new recruits some insight as to what lay ahead. My father had finished speaking and was gathering his things to leave when Elvis approached him. "Is there someplace inside this building where I could get change?" Elvis asked, explaining that he wanted to use one of the payphones. My father reached into his pocket and offered Elvis a dime. Elvis took it and thanked him. Elvis had his physical, and by that afternoon he was sworn into the U.S. Army. Due to Elvis's fame, the press covered the event. Photographers took pictures of him with my dad for the newspapers, and whenever I look at those clippings, it still hits me. Here is a young Elvis, and here is my dad. They were worlds apart, yet at that moment they were connected for the first time. My father came home that evening with 2 publicity photos of Elvis, one signed to Mike and the other to Rosemary. Before going to bed, he wrote inside my sister's small autograph book, "Today I shook the hand of Elvis Presley, March 24, 1958. Elvis's mother had become ill, and that August, the Army granted Elvis an emergency leave so he could return to Memphis to see her. His mother passed away on August 14, 1958, and he was granted an extended stay for her funeral. On March 7, 1960, after 24 months of active duty, Elvis returned to Memphis again, this time as a civilian with 4 years left in the reserves. A few nights later, my father decided to stop by Graceland after work, hoping for some follow-up public relations tidbits for an Army newsletter. He parked his Army sedan near Graceland's driveway and walked toward its closed gates, where some others were milling about. The gates had become a popular place for fans to hang out, chat, and catch a glimpse of Elvis. My dad saw Elvis and a few others standing in the driveway, talking to a teenager with a bandaged hand. When Elvis noticed my father, still dressed in his Army uniform, he yelled, "Let him in," to a guard near the gates. My father learned that Elvis had assisted the teenager 2 nights earlier when he'd been in a motorcycle accident near Graceland, and the teen had returned to thank him. My dad lucked out. He got to see Elvis and now had a story. My father stopped by Graceland a few more times the following year, along with a friend, a reporter for the Memphis Press Scimitar, who was also looking for Elvis-related pieces. They became friendly with a guard at the gates named Travis Smith, who happened to be Elvis's uncle. One evening, Travis invited my dad to bring my mom and join Elvis at a local movie theater called the Memphian, where Elvis often treated others to movie showings. It was the only way he could watch a movie out of the public eye. As Travis had requested, my parents drove to Graceland and waited in their car by the front gates. Before long, a few other cars emerged from around back of the mansion and, as they exited the driveway, my father eased in behind them and followed. It was well after midnight when my parents arrived at the theater, its marquee dark, showing it was closed to the public. They saw Elvis and a few others already out of their cars and talking, so they approached them. Recognizing my dad, Elvis shook his hand and my father introduced my mother. The group soon entered the lobby and Elvis walked over to the food counter while my parents and some other guests made their way inside to get seats. Before long, Elvis came walking down the aisle with popcorn in hand. Upon noticing my father again, he tossed out jokingly, "Hey, Sarge, I'm ready to go back into the Army." My dad replied, "We'll be glad to have you back." Elvis screened 2 movies that night, and it wouldn't be until the wee hours of the morning when everyone left the theater. Not long afterward, Travis invited my parents for a second outing, telling them Elvis was renting the Memphis Fairgrounds amusement park, and friends and guests were welcome to bring their children. Travis and his wife were going along this time, and he told my dad when and where to meet them after the park closed to the public. I was 5 years old when I rode with my family to the fairgrounds that night. Although I was too young to remember much, that evening became a memorable experience for my entire family. My brother and one of his friends drove separately. A security guard led us into the entrance of the amusement park, where we waited alongside other invited guests. Travis arrived and introduced his wife Lorraine to my parents. Before long, a black car slowly pulled up to the entrance and the security guard waved it inside. The car came to a stop, and Elvis stepped out, dressed in a dark shirt with dark pants and wearing a white captain's hat. My most vivid memory is one of seeing Elvis shake hands with people and thinking he must be important, for his face looked just like the ones I'd seen on some record sleeves at home. My parents greeted Elvis, and as my father introduced each one of us, Elvis shook hands with Mike and Rosemary, then patted Terry and me on our heads. When my mom mentioned that my brother was taking guitar lessons, Elvis joked, "I've got one at home he can have because I can't play the thing." Everyone laughed, and then the group continued inside, following Elvis to the park's large wooden roller coaster, a ride that would remain one of his favorites. Elvis climbed into the front car with his date, Bonnie Bunkley, and as the seats began to fill, Travis approached my mom. "Want to ride with me?" he asked. Never having been on a roller coaster before, she told him yes, as long as he picked a safe and not too scary seat. They ended up sitting in the very last car, which, unbeknownst to my mom, was notorious for being rough. My father and Lorraine Smith sat in the car in front of them, while my siblings and I stood by to watch. Screams of fright and laughter echoed from the ride as it raced by us multiple times before finally coming to a halt. When everyone got out, my mother, a little rattled but smiling, told Travis, "I think I might just have a heart attack right here." Elvis continued through the park with his date and some friends, while my parents took my sisters and me to the kiddie section. My brother and his friend decided to wander the park alone. A concession stand was open to all of us, and we got to enjoy the rides as many times as we wanted. Our special night was over too soon. Catching up with Travis and Elvis, my parents thanked them for our amazing evening. Mike and his friend begged my parents to let them stay longer. They didn't return home until nearly sunrise. Later, still excited, Mike told my parents that Elvis and his friends had divided into groups, and he got to drive the Dodgem cars with them. Then Elvis sent someone across the street to get milkshakes at a place with 2 large polar bears out front called the Polar Bear Frozen Custard Shop. I didn't know it then, but that night was just a preview of Elvis's giving nature. Chapter 2. By the early 1960s, my family was living in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in one of the new suburbs springing up around Memphis. Our home was half a block down the road from a cotton field that a farmer and his mule plowed from time to time, a remnant from the Old South. When the post-war boom hit, part of the field was paved and a gas station was erected there as modernization swept across Memphis, eventually surrounding our home with malls and fast food restaurants. My parents were hard-working, everyday people. My father had retired from the Army and was managing a local department store. My mother worked up the street from our home, managing a stamp store. My siblings and I were baptized, and our parents did their best to raise us with good morals and values. During my childhood and early teens, As I was learning to read and write and discovered a love of art, Elvis's celebrity continued to skyrocket. He made music and movies, got married, and had a child. On occasion, when relatives visited us in Memphis, they wanted to see Graceland. We accommodated them and rode along with the security guard in a striped, canopied pink Jeep, renowned at the estate, up Graceland's driveway and back. It was a small tour of the estate, usually offered when Elvis was out of town. Tomboyish, I roller skated, rode horses, and clambered up trees. I often climbed on my brother's motorcycle, too, pretending to ride it. Though our parents worried, occasionally Mike would take me out for a short spin and I would be thrilled. My big brother's love for motorcycles quickly became my own obsession. When I was 14, I pestered my father to purchase a mini bike for me. My parents were apprehensive, having had enough safety concerns with my brother riding motorcycles, but my father gave in, and I got my mini bike. I continued to love motorcycles, and years later I would eventually get my own. Art, however, was my biggest passion. I was constantly drawing and painting, and I revered my brother Mike, a wonderful artist who had begun taking art classes in college. I had an inspirational art teacher in high school named Mrs. Murphy, who usually dressed in purple. She wore purple eyeglasses and carried a purple cane. Even her silvery white hair seemed to have a purple hue. Art was an easy way for me to express myself, and by my teens I was thinking about how to turn my passion into a career. I also loved to sing. Pretending my hairbrush was a microphone, I'd dress up in one of my mother's old skirts and croon along with various records. This wasn't surprising to anyone, because music was central to our home life. My mother was a self-taught musician who could play piano, guitar, and mandolin. Her father had been the minister of a small church in Arkansas, and having been spiritually influenced by both parents, she usually played gospel hymns on our piano. My mom enjoyed a variety of music, from classical to gospel, and when she was home, you'd hear the voices of Dean Martin, Bing Crosby, Engelbert Humperdinck, Tom Jones, and yes, Elvis, resonating from the stereo in our living room. Her love of music rubbed off on us. Terry became interested in the piano and began taking lessons, practicing fervently. At 13, I started taking vocal lessons. I could play piano a little bit by ear and occasionally fooled around on a big red guitar I'd been given, but usually when I wanted to sing, I'd pester Terry to accompany me on the piano. Despite the fact that our parents weren't wealthy and had 4 children to feed and clothe, they had generously found the money for music lessons when we expressed our interest. Whenever my mother was playing the piano, I'd wander in and stand behind her to sing. My father and sisters would occasionally join in, making those moments some of my fondest memories. When answering machines later came out, my mother, sisters, and I recorded a singing message in harmony on a whim. Friends claimed we sounded just like the Andrews sisters. As much as I enjoyed singing, I was too self-conscious and concerned about what others thought to sing in public. I made my family look the other way when I practiced, and even asked them not to come to my recitals. I continued voice lessons through high school, then stopped, unable to overcome this great shyness. I decided it would be all right to let this particular passion of mine remain a childhood fantasy, safely tucked away. Despite my tomboyish inclinations, my sister Terry and I used to cut out pictures of models we liked from McCall's magazine and the Sears catalog, using them like paper dolls. As a teenager, I thought, wow, being a model sounds so cool. At 16, I finally saw my first live fashion model and caught a glimpse of the world beyond Memphis when I tagged along with Rosemary and her girlfriend to Lowenstein Department Store downtown to watch auditions for a pageant called Model of the Year. The pageant was put on by Stuart Cowley, the owner of a New York modeling agency. As I stood among the crowd gathered to view the entrance, I became fascinated by the sight of a female model seated beside Mr. Cowley, helping him interview contestants. This girl was rail thin and she'd cut her black hair very short. In my mind, she represented everything I thought a New York City model must be. Looking about the room, Mr. Cowley stood up at one point and walked our way. He approached me and asked, "Why aren't you in the contest?" Offering me an entry form, he returned to his table. I began filling out the form, but my hand was shaking. I was excited, but unprepared for this. Rosemary pressed me to personally hand the form back to Mr. Cowley and said, "Make sure you smile." She had more confidence in me than I did. I returned the form, but, upon seeing my age, Mr. Cowley asked me to come back in a few years, for 18 was the eligible age to enter. A few weeks later, through friends, I modeled some clothing alongside 2 other girls during a brief segment of the show Talent Party, which showcased bands. My interest in modeling had outweighed any fears. Someone saw me on the show, and not long afterward, I was contacted and hired to work in a hometown television commercial. I also held 2 part-time jobs after school, working at a restaurant on weekends and decorating the windows of a dress shop. I viewed the latter as an apprenticeship and a stepping stone in the artistic field. My interest in art continued throughout high school, and I began entering my paintings into local art competitions, even winning some awards. I graduated in the spring of 1974 with scholarship money to put toward a college that fall. I chose the Memphis Academy of Art, a small private college of art and design. As I started classes, I gave up my job at the restaurant but continued working part-time at the dress shop. I was one of the younger students in my classes. Between my drawing, sculpting, and pottery courses, I felt out of my depth and slightly overwhelmed. Although my teachers, friends, and family told me I had talent, and I believed it on some level, the Academy's curriculum proved to be too intense for me. Wanting to slow down and figure out my future one step at a time, I decided to take a sabbatical from the Art Academy after my first year. I hoped to find a different path that could lead to a future art-related career. In the spring of 1975, Terry saw an ad for the Miss Memphis pageant. Pageants were prominent events in the South, and she decided to enter, winning first runner-up. Finding it challenging and fun, by the end of that year, she began encouraging me to enter the Miss Tennessee Universe pageant. I wasn't a competitive person, but I could definitely see how competing could help me overcome my shyness. So, with nothing to lose, in the beginning of 1976, I took the plunge. The title went to the sister of the pageant's executive director, and I placed first runner-up. In February 1976, my family moved into a larger home on a nice corner lot in East Memphis. My father still managed a local department store, and my mother had been working for the Internal Revenue Service. My brother, now a firefighter, lived close by with his wife and 2 daughters, while my sisters and I still lived at home. Rosemary worked in sales, Terry attended Memphis State University, and I did extra work at the dress shop while tending to the store's windows. My parents' relationship had not been at its best the past few years. My mother had applied for a divorce twice in 1974, but dismissed it both times, hoping to work things out. When my parents purchased our new home, my siblings and I wanted to believe it was the beginning of a brighter future for them. In the spring, Terry entered Miss Memphis again and won. This led her to the Miss Tennessee pageant in June, and our family proudly watched as she was crowned Miss Tennessee of 1976. The pageants had been exciting, and with my sisters encouraging me, I entered a few more local ones around the same time, winning Miss Traffic Safety and Duchess in our annual Cotton Carnival Ball. As Miss Tennessee, Terry was invited that summer to a country club in Memphis, where she got free tickets to see Elvis perform at our local Mid-South Coliseum on July 5th. Due to official obligations elsewhere, she was unable to go to the concert, so she gave the tickets to my mother, Rosemary, and me. Little did my family or I know that, in the very near future, Terry's title would open the door to Graceland, leading me straight into Elvis's life. When July 5th rolled around, I was thrilled to see Elvis perform for the first time. I didn't personally own any Elvis albums, but my mother had his gospel and Christmas ones, and my brother Mike owned a few of Elvis's Sun Label 45s. I enjoyed a variety of music from classical to rock and roll, and some of my favorite bands at the time were Fleetwood Mac and Led Zeppelin, and the singer Elton John. Our seats weren't too close to the stage, but as Elvis entered and the cameras began flashing, I was completely spellbound. The man whose voice I'd grown up hearing all my life was suddenly right there in front of me, flesh and blood, and very real. It was wonderful to hear him sing the songs that I'd heard before only on television and the radio. His hair was longer, and he looked a little heavier than in his earlier years, but I was captivated by the way Elvis strutted onto the stage, dressed in a white jumpsuit with an Egyptian bird design, blue silk puff sleeves, and a matching belt with chains hanging from his waist. That summer night in 1976, the crowd was a mix of middle-aged adults, teens, and children. Elvis put on a great show, and at one point that night, he told the audience, "The first record that I did here in Memphis, was That's All Right, Mama," and so forth, and they had a couple of people say, "Well, you can't do that anymore. You, by God, watch me." He went full force into the song then and proved them wrong. My mother, sister, and I were 3 out of thousands that night, captivated by a show that unfortunately would turn out to be Elvis's last hometown performance. Chapter 3. In early September 1976, Terry went to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to represent the state of Tennessee in the Miss America pageant. I was able to work around my job at the dress shop and go with my family to New Jersey to support her. Terry was an extremely gifted pianist whose many hours of disciplined practice had gotten her far. On one of the preliminary nights, She won all 3 honors in the swimsuit, talent, and evening gown competition. Although the Miss America crown wouldn't be hers that year, she was always a winner in my eyes. Before going to New Jersey, I had entered and won Miss Mid-South Fair, a huge 2-week event that I looked forward to every year when it came to Memphis at the end of September. A little over a week after returning from New Jersey, the Mid-South Fair began, and I attended it each day as the official hostess. As usual, it was a lot of fun, but before I knew it, the fair was over, and so was the month of October. A typical weekend night in Memphis usually found my sisters and me out to dinner, the movies, or socializing with friends. On the evening of Friday, November 19, 1976, however, all 3 of us were at home. We were sitting in the den with Larry, a young man I'd been seeing, when the phone rang. Our mother answered it in the kitchen, then entered the den to say that George Klein was calling for Terry. My sisters and I exchanged curious looks. George was a well-known local disc jockey and television personality. Last, but certainly not least, he was also a longtime friend of Elvis Presley's. Terry picked up the receiver in the kitchen. Meanwhile, our mother, looking slightly stunned, reported that George had told her Elvis had been dating around and would like to meet the new Miss Tennessee. He was inviting Terry to Graceland. It certainly wasn't your everyday phone call. Having seen Graceland only from the outside made it all the more surreal. Rosemary and I scurried into the kitchen to unashamedly eavesdrop on Terry's conversation. Terry may have been Miss Tennessee, but the idea of a date with Elvis was unimaginable to my sisters and me. That only happened in the movies. Terry had also been dating someone since high school, so upon hearing her accept the invitation, we knew she had done so for the same reason we would have. She was eager to meet Elvis in person and get a peek inside Graceland. The 3 of us were very close, and knowing Terry would feel uneasy about going alone, Rosemary brought up the possibility of the 2 of us accompanying her. As exciting as it sounded, I didn't feel comfortable with this idea because we hadn't been invited. Before I could protest, however, Rosemary quickly approached Terry while she was still on the phone and whispered, "Ask George if Ginger and I can come." Terry paused for a second. She knew this wasn't proper, but she was our sister, and we always looked out for each other, so she went ahead and asked. Then, lowering the receiver from her ear, she told us George had sounded a bit hesitant and put her on hold while he checked. Now we were embarrassed. When George came back on the line, however, much to our relief, Terry nodded yes, and Rosemary and I went to tell our mother and Larry. Larry wasn't too keen about me going to Graceland, but seeing how excited we all were, he said, "I don't blame you for wanting to go," and left. When Terry finally hung up the phone and joined us back in the den, she said Elvis had wanted to send a car for us, but she told him she would drive. George had asked what car we would be in so he could tell the guard at the front gates to watch for us. Our appointed time to be at Graceland was 11 p.m. We began getting ready, feeling enthusiastic but nervous. Meeting Elvis plus touring the inside of Graceland meant we were in for a double treat. As we chatted and touched up our makeup, Terry said, "I'm glad you and Rosemary are going." A few moments later, she reflected on George's hesitancy and having to check about it. "I really hope it's all right you're coming with me." Feeling uneasy about it myself and not wanting Terry to feel worried, I walked away and stopped getting ready. Rosemary soon noticed and told me, "George said it was fine." Then, half joking, she added, "The worst Elvis can do is ask us to leave." She was right, so I finished getting dressed. By 10:30, we were saying goodbye to our parents and excitedly heading out the door. Graceland was a little less than half an hour from our home. We were so keyed up we chatted all the way over. What once had been a section of Highway 51 South was now Elvis Presley Boulevard. As we turned onto it, the 3 of us grew quieter. The fieldstone wall surrounding Graceland soon came into view and, as we entered the turning lane, blinker flashing, the wrought iron gates with the image of Elvis holding a guitar slowly began to open. It was an incredible feeling, knowing this was happening just for us. Terry gave her name at the guardhouse. The gates swung closed behind us as we started up the long driveway, eventually stopping just shy of Graceland's lit front porch. We sat in the car for a few moments, unsure of what to do next. Would someone come out to get us? Should we park here or around back? A security guard soon emerged from the darkness and approached the driver's side of the car. Terry lowered her window and asked, "What should we do?" Smiling, the guard replied, "Try knocking on the front door." My sisters and I climbed out of the car, laughing at ourselves and the guard's comment, as our nerves got the better of us. Passing between 2 huge lion statues, we jokingly chanted, "Lions and tigers and bears, oh my," in an effort to relax. We walked up the stone steps to the front porch where Rosemary, always the bravest among us, pressed the doorbell beside the green wrought-iron front door. Expecting Elvis to appear at any moment, my earlier concerns about showing up uninvited resurfaced. I grew increasingly anxious, wondering, what if Elvis really doesn't want Rosemary and me here? I hung back, letting Rosemary and Terry wait at the door. When it opened, George Klein greeted us, which surprised me. Naive as this may seem, because this was Elvis's house, I expected him to answer the door. George was the same age as Elvis, 41, and a friendly guy with black hair. It had been his talent party show that I had once briefly modeled on. I didn't say anything about this because I didn't think he would remember. He introduced himself and then beckoned for us to follow him. Feeling like Alice stepping through the looking glass, I took a deep breath and entered Graceland for the first time. My feet sank into thick red shag carpet, which extended into the foyer and up a staircase with a gold and white banister and railings. George invited us into the dining room. Passing beneath an enormous ornate crystal chandelier, I glanced to the right and saw a room decorated all in red with French provincial furniture. Peacock-stained glass windows were on either side of the entrance to a music room dominated by a black baby grand piano. Many people have referred to this red decor as gaudy, and it would eventually be changed. But gaudy or not, it impressed me at the time, and it's still one of my most lasting memories of Graceland. To my left I heard voices. I turned and saw some people seated in red, silver-studded, high-backed chairs around a mirrored dining table. Cigar smoke curled into the air as we approached. Staring at the chair at the end of the table, its back facing us, I excitedly thought, "This has to be Elvis," and slowed my steps, almost holding my breath. I was wrong. George introduced the chair's occupant as Gigi Gamble. His wife, Elvis's cousin Patsy Presley, was there too, along with another cousin, Billy Smith, and Billy's wife Jo. They were playing cards, the men smoking cigars, all of them casually dressed in jeans and t-shirts or blouses. Everyone greeted us cordially. I couldn't tell by their reaction whether they had been expecting us or knew who we were, but I did get the sense that they were sizing us up as they gave us quick up-and-down appraising looks. The three of us had dressed nicely to meet Elvis, but hadn't put a lot of thought into overly trying to impress anyone. George then led us through the kitchen. Its floor was covered in wall-to-wall carpet in a multicolor patchwork design. I had never seen carpeting in a kitchen, but this was Elvis's home, so I figured there would be much I had never seen before. The room looked warm, with dark brown cabinets and stained glass lamps hanging from the ceiling. The kitchen had a breakfast nook and opened into a den. "This is the jungle room," George announced, gesturing around the den as he paused to answer a green phone buzzing on a nearby table. As I watched George listen to someone on the phone, I heard laughter echoing from the dining room, and it struck me how comfortable everyone was in Elvis's home. I began to relax a little and gazed around the room. The jungle room was far from your typical den. I noticed water trickling down the face of a stone-covered back wall, and the furniture featured carved animal heads and engravings. George hung up the phone. "Can you please wait right here?" he asked. "Elvis isn't ready yet. He's practicing karate." Then he walked away, leaving the three of us alone in the room. It seemed a little odd that Elvis would invite us here at a certain time and not be ready. Still, I wasn't complaining. I was excited just to be seeing inside Graceland. I sat on a faux fur chair with wooden arms carved to look like Asian dragon heads. Rosemary and Terry chose a matching couch. In front of it was a huge coffee table made of lacquered wood. Statues of jungle animals were placed randomly about the room. A large mirror framed with feathers was hanging on a side wall, and the green carpet was, surprisingly, on parts of the ceiling as well as the floor. After a few minutes, a maid entered and offered us a drink. We asked for sodas and, when she left, eased our tension by taking our mirrored compacts out from our purses, opening them, and jokingly pretending to primp. Suddenly, I noticed cameras mounted on the walls near the ceiling. The cameras seemed to be aimed our way. I quickly closed my compact and pointed them out to my sisters. Mortified, I wondered if we were being watched. The maid returned with our drinks, and we sat quietly, now cautious of every move we made. Considering the late hour, I was surprised that Graceland was so active. Phones periodically buzzed, they did not ring, and various people came and went. At one point, a young man in his 20s, with long blonde hair, stepped into the jungle room and casually introduced himself as Elvis's brother, Ricky Stanley. Brother? I was puzzled. I didn't know Elvis had any siblings. Later, I learned that Ricky was Elvis's stepbrother. His mother, Dee, had married Elvis's father, Vernon, after Gladys Presley died. We introduced ourselves and found out that Ricky worked as an aide to Elvis. Not long afterward, a short, dark-haired man in his 40s appeared and introduced himself as Charlie Hodge. With a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, he began telling off-colored jokes, all the while leaning as if balancing on the deck of a heeling ship. If Elvis was considered the king of rock and roll, I thought Charlie would certainly qualify as his court jester. I wondered if he'd been sent as Presley to entertain us. As I discovered after I started seeing Elvis, Charlie sang harmony with Elvis and assisted him on stage during his shows. George finally returned. "Elvis is still practicing karate," he said. "Would you like to see downstairs?" Thinking we were downstairs, I was surprised to follow him down a staircase at the back of the den. We entered a colorful room with vibrantly patterned fabric in blue, red, and yellow lining its walls and ceiling. Pieces of furniture were upholstered in matching material. An electric organ stood against one wall, and a billiard table sat in the middle of the room beneath two large Tiffany-style lamps suspended from the ceiling. George then took us into another room he called the TV room. I felt immediately disoriented as we entered this room because it was filled with mirrors. Mirrors covered the ceiling, framed the fireplace, and covered a square coffee table. What looked to be small mirrors were shining in the embroidered fabric of yellow and white pillows scattered across a large navy sectional sofa. Yellow leather stools were pulled up to the bar, and 3 television sets had been built into a side wall. A huge white lightning bolt inside navy and yellow clouds had been painted above the couch. George explained that Elvis had a motto, TCB, which stood for Taking Care of Business. The lightning bolt was a symbol for taking care of business lightning fast. A phone began to buzz in the room. George answered it, listened, then hung up, saying we were going upstairs next to Elvis's daughter's room. Upstairs? I couldn't believe it. Our tour had helped me calm down, but now my nerves began to hum again. I knew Elvis had to be on the top floor because we'd pretty much covered the entire downstairs. The time had come, I thought. We were finally going to meet him. Elvis's relatives were still playing cards in the dining room as we passed by them again, this time headed for the foyer. When George started up the staircase, my heart began to beat even faster. At the top, we followed him down a hall and into Lisa's bedroom. This room was decorated mainly in yellow and white. A black leather sofa was against the wall to the right, and the center of the room was dominated by a large round bed blanketed in white faux fur with matching canopy. My sisters and I sat on the couch, and George turned on a nearby television set. George leaned back against Lisa's bed and continued visiting with us. Ricky and Billy Smith both entered, leaning against the bed and joining the conversation. I hadn't paid any attention to the time and glanced at my watch. It was now approaching 1 a.m. 2 hours had passed since our arrival. Although it hadn't really felt like that much time had gone by. The more Ricky, George, and Billy continued to talk, the more I began to wonder whether they were covering for Elvis. Had he changed his mind about meeting us? Now that we'd been entertained with a tour, would we be asked to leave without meeting him? Another man's figure appeared in the doorway of Lisa's room. I turned to look, prepared to greet another relative or friend, but it was Elvis entering the room. I was caught off guard. I had halfway been expecting to hear trumpets sound at his entrance. Elvis's jet-black hair was casually styled. There was no pompadour or glitzy outfit, just Elvis, dressed in a dark blue karate top, black pants, and black boots. I was immediately attracted to him. His hair looked soft and shiny. His skin was clean-shaven and smooth. Thinking he was gorgeous, my shyness flew right out the window. "Hi, Elvis," I blurted, as if I'd known him for years. "Hi," Elvis said, and shook our hands, correctly acknowledging my sisters and me by name, one by one. Someone had obviously informed him who was who. Then, crossing the room in front of us, Elvis sat in a large dark chair to our right and put a cigar to his lips. Billy quickly leaned over and lit it for him. Elvis settled farther back in the chair and apologized for keeping us waiting. Billy then left the room while Elvis proceeded to ask Terry about herself. She talked about her music and the various titles she had won. "How about you?" Elvis asked me. "Have you won any titles?" I told him a little about myself. When Elvis got to Rosemary, she mentioned she had never entered any pageants outside of high school. He smiled and said, "Well, you should have, but for now you'll just have to be misunderstood." We all laughed. The more Elvis joked around with us, the more I noticed how similar his humor was to ours. I'd had this feeling of a powerful presence and energy the minute Elvis entered the room, and he continued to hold my focus completely throughout the night. At the same time, I was taken by how down-to-earth he was, and by his sexy smile and laugh. We continued to talk, with Ricky and George chiming in periodically. Elvis told us what an honor it was to have the street name changed to Elvis Presley Boulevard and mentioned he sometimes joked, "Get off my street," to other motorists while driving down it. He talked about karate, too, letting us know he was a 9th-degree black belt. "It's a beautiful art form," I told him, adding that I'd wanted to take lessons when I was 16, but my parents thought I was too young. Elvis disagreed, saying it was never too young to start. Terry talked about the classical piano music she enjoyed. I brought up my love for art, but didn't dare mention my singing. Rosemary, the most comical of the three of us, often had him laughing. Elvis was polite and easy to talk with, which was putting me at ease, until he tilted his head to one side, looked toward the floor, and said, "Ginger, you're burning a hole right through me." His intense blue eyes slowly drifted back up to my face. "Who, me?" I asked. "Yes, you," he replied. I didn't know what he meant, as I didn't feel like I'd been staring at him. We were just talking. I was embarrassed and felt a flash of heat warm my face. We talked a little more, then Elvis asked, "Would you like to see the rest of the upstairs?" Thrilled, we said, "Sure." Along with Ricky and George, we followed Elvis out into the hall. I was still holding my unfinished glass of soda. Elvis reached for it, took a sip, and handed it back to me. This distracted me so much that I made a wrong turn and headed toward the front stairs. I then felt Elvis's hands on my shoulders, gently turning me and guiding me back through a set of double doors. Everyone followed Elvis and me as we cut through an office, and then another set of double doors, into his master bedroom. The first thing that struck me was that the matching couch and chairs looked identical to the furniture we had in our den at home. What were the odds of that? Otherwise, the room decor here was very different from anything I'd ever seen before. A shiny black naugahyde headboard crowned the massive bed, which Elvis proudly told us was 9 feet by 9 feet. Reading lamps were attached to the wall on either side of it. The same red shag carpet covered the floor, with black and gold wallpaper lining one wall and padding on the other. The bedroom doors and ceiling were also padded, and, much to my surprise, there were 2 television sets embedded in the ceiling. Elvis explained the padding by saying he didn't care for outside noise when he slept. Ricky left as my sisters and I followed Elvis, along with George, into his office. It was decorated in masculine tans and browns. On my left was a glass case filled with rifles and handguns. In the center of the room, 2 couches faced each other, a coffee table between them. Near the back of the room was a large desk with a chair, and behind it 2 bookcases stood against the wall. Elvis walked over to an electric organ near a closed accordion-style door and sat down on the bench. I stood behind him with George and my sisters gathered around. Something about this felt comfortably familiar, because I'd so often stood and sung behind my mom while she played piano. Placing his fingers on the keyboard, Elvis began to sing "You'll Never Walk Alone." If I'd ever felt like I was dreaming, it was now. At various times during the song, Elvis looked up from the organ, smiling at Rosemary and Terry, or glancing over his shoulder to smile at me. At one point, I looked into the mirror above the organ and noticed George yawning. That made me wonder whether he'd seen Elvis do this sort of thing many times before, or if he was just tired because it was so late. Elvis finished and we applauded. Standing up, he said, "I'd like to show you my dressing area." I was surprised by this. I'd always thought of people's closets as personal. On the other hand, seeing Elvis's dressing room would be an added bonus because I was enjoying being with him and thrilled by the idea of seeing one of his inner sanctums. We followed Elvis back through his bedroom and into his bathroom, which was carpeted in the same royal red shag carpet. On my left stood a black commode with a telephone attached to the wall nearby. A black vanity was covered with toiletries on the right. Above it, the mirrored wall was outlined with makeup lights. Beyond an enormous curved shower with multicolored tiles, we entered Elvis's dressing area. It was filled with racks of clothing, surrounding a bed covered in a faux fur similar to the one in Lisa's room. A bust of the Greek god Apollo sat on a pedestal beside an open doorway leading out to the hall. Later, Elvis would tell me he thought the bust resembled him. I thought it did, too. Pointing out a few stage jumpsuits, Elvis said he was proud of the workmanship that went into making them. He told us they were made of material that didn't let any air in or out. Then he began showing us his boots and casual clothes. Casual for Elvis appeared to be coats with fur collars, brightly colored, high-collared satin shirts, flared pants, and hats that looked like they could have been worn on the set of the movie Shaft. I could understand Elvis wanting to show us his costumes, but again, I was surprised that he'd be willing to show us his more personal clothes. Was this an extension of his persona? Was this something he felt he needed to do with us? When Elvis was finished giving us a tour of his dressing area, he excused himself and, as he walked toward the front of the bathroom, called out for George to follow him. My sisters and I now found ourselves in the extraordinary position of standing alone in Elvis Presley's closet, trying to process what had started out as an innocent evening at home. Elvis had been captivating, entertaining, funny, and gracious. We talked quietly, assuming the show was over and we'd be asked to leave when George reappeared. To my surprise, George came back and said, "Ginger, Elvis would like to see you for a minute." What did Elvis want with me? I glanced uncertainly at Terry and Rosemary. "He's waiting for you," George urged, motioning me toward the front of the bathroom. Taking a few steps forward, I turned back to see George guiding my sisters out through the door by the dressing area. My anxiety roared back. My sisters and I had acted as a safety net for each other, but now I was on my own. When I stepped past the doorway of his bathroom, I saw Elvis seated on the side of his bed. He smiled and patted the red bedspread, motioning me to sit down next to him. Unsure of what he wanted, I nervously walked in and complied. "Did you notice I was paying more attention to you than to your sisters?" he asked with a faint smile. I briefly looked away. My heart began to pound. Was Elvis actually hitting on me? It went far beyond my wildest imaginings that he would single me out. I felt he had treated the three of us fairly equally, but when I thought back, I remembered his comment about me burning a hole through him, how he'd taken a sip from my glass of soda, and the way he'd placed his hands on my shoulders in the hallway. Was that what he meant? Not quite sure, I looked at him and answered, "Yes." He nodded. "When I like someone, I really like them a lot," he said. "It's not just a fling. I don't like one-night stands." "I don't like one-night stands either," I replied, wanting him to be sure I wasn't that kind of woman. Elvis regarded me silently for a moment, then gestured toward the window. "I'm not that straight out there," he said. "If you cut me, I bleed." I couldn't believe that Elvis, a charismatic, handsome superstar, was talking to me in this intimate way. The only thing I could think to say was, "I understand." "Good," he replied. He leaned over then and picked up a book lying with some others on the floor beside his bed. It was the Book of Numbers by Cairo, the world-famous seer. "When's your birthday?" Elvis asked, opening the book. "November 13th, I replied. "You're a number 4, he said, and began explaining that he reached the number by adding the 1 and 3 together. Picking up a pair of glasses from his night table, he put them on and began reading to me about the number 4. He told me that 4s are sensitive and had their feelings hurt easily. 4s were likely to feel lonely and isolated, with few real friends, but to the few friends they did have, they are very loyal. Elvis had my attention. I didn't feel lonely, but I was shy, sensitive, and loyal to my friends. Elvis obviously was passionate about the subject of numerology, and I found myself being drawn into it. Telling me January 8 was his birthday, which made him a number 8, he read on regarding that number. He said these people were often misunderstood and for this reason felt lonely. They usually play some important role on life's stage, but usually one which is fatalistic, or as the instrument of fate for others. He also said that 8 people are either very successful or complete failures. They feel different from others, and seldom reap the reward for the good they may do while they are living. It is only after their death that they are praised and honored. My first thought was, wow, some of the characteristics really seem to fit him, but Elvis, lonely? That was difficult for me to believe, given the number of people gathered downstairs on this night. Elvis stayed on the topic of numerology for a while, then lifted another, larger book off the floor and began leafing through it. "This is supposed to be an illustration of God," he said, stopping on a certain page and showing it to me. It was a drawing of a man with a long white beard, seated on a throne with symbols of fire, ice, rain, and wind at his sides. The book reminded me of a larger illustrated Bible my mother had that she often read to my siblings and me when we were younger. Still holding the big book in his hands, Elvis settled farther back on the bed and motioned me up beside him. By now, I was feeling more comfortable and decided it was a harmless enough request. Elvis seemed absorbed by the book. I scooted up to sit right next to him with my back against a pillow. He then surprised me again by handing me the book and asking me to read aloud. I did, feeling shy about it. I didn't want to make a mistake because I could feel him watching me closely. The subject matter in this book was different. I was again drawn into it while Elvis observed, periodically sipping ice water from a large glass jar sitting on his night table. Cool air was blowing from an air conditioner unit situated inside the bedroom's front window. I was chilled, but Elvis seemed fine, and I didn't feel right asking him to turn it down. We took turns reading and talking into the early morning. At one point, Elvis went into the bathroom, leaving me to think that it had been an unforgettable night. I was going to have quite a story to tell my friends. Having been up almost 24 hours by now, however, I was starting to feel overwhelmed by fatigue. I hated it, but could tell that I wasn't going to be able to concentrate well anymore. Now that Elvis was out of the room, I also became aware that a lot of time had gone by and our parents still hadn't heard from us. I was worried, too, about Terry and Rosemary having to wait for me. When Elvis returned from the bathroom, I politely said, "Elvis, I should find my sisters and probably leave. It's really late." He sat back on the bed. "They've already gone," he said casually. "Your sisters went home earlier." I was stunned. They'd already left? I'd been at Graceland all this time without them? Puzzled, I wondered how he knew. Had Elvis arranged all this earlier with George? "Someone will take you home when you're ready," Elvis added, watching the confused expressions flit across my face. I decided that Elvis was probably tired, too. Thinking it was proper for me to go, I thanked him on behalf of my sisters and myself for the night. He moved to the edge of the bed, and I inched my way beside him as he picked up a telephone receiver from his night table and asked someone to give me a ride home. To my shock, he added, "Please be sure and get her number," before hanging up. Then he turned to me and said, "You should always politely ask someone to do something for you. Never tell a person what to do." As I nodded, still dumbstruck, Elvis took a pen and a matchbook from the night table drawer, opened the matchbook, and asked, "What's your phone number?" This can't be happening. My thoughts suddenly flashed on Larry, who hadn't wanted me to come to Graceland tonight. Despite feeling conflicted, I gave Elvis my number. He wrote it down. As I looked at him, Elvis suddenly leaned in toward me, catching me totally off guard. He kept his hands on the bed and gave me a quick, light kiss on the lips. It was so quick I barely had time to register what had just happened, but I was stunned and excited. Afterward, I walked out of Graceland in a trance. As I rode home with an employee named Steve Smith, I went over the kiss again in my mind. I certainly didn't want Elvis to get the wrong impression of me. I wasn't a seasoned pro when it came to sex or relationships. On the other hand, I hoped he had liked kissing me. Even though it was nearly sunrise, the lights were on inside my house when we pulled up to the curb. Before getting out, Steve asked me for my phone number. Giving it a second time, I quickly ran inside. My mother and sisters were sitting on the couch in our den. I figured my father must be in bed because he sometimes worked on weekends. Our parents had been excited when we were invited to Graceland, but my mother admitted now that they'd started worrying when so much time went by without any word from us. "I felt bad about leaving you there," Terry said, explaining that George had taken them outside to a racquetball court behind the house, where Charlie and Ricky joined them for a tour of the court. George then told Terry and Rosemary that Elvis wanted to spend more time with me, and that they were welcome to wait if they wanted, or, as it was so late, to leave. He had assured them that Elvis would see I got home safely. Exhausted, but still running on nerves, I filled them in on what had happened, leaving out the kiss. We weren't a kiss-and-tell sort of family. Some things were personal, and we were private with each other when it came to that sort of thing. Now that I was home, the whole night seemed unreal. Elvis was different from anyone I'd ever met. Here was this rock-and-roll superstar singing to my sisters and me, showing us his closet, and then inviting me to join him on his bed, where he'd been a gentleman. He'd read religious books with me and shared his thoughts and feelings. Elvis had been polite and funny, too, which I related to. He demonstrated a sincere desire for me to understand what he was about in a short amount of time, and in the hours we'd spent together, I'd felt an intense attraction between us. I had enjoyed the night. It was magical and unique, and from what Elvis had said and how he had acted, I thought he had enjoyed spending time with me, too. When I was finally alone in my bed that morning, none of that seemed real or even possible. I was in turmoil. Would Elvis call me? And if he did, would I agree to see him again, knowing it would hurt Larry, the nice guy I'd been dating? I honestly didn't know if I was more afraid of Elvis being attracted to me because of this, or more afraid that I'd find myself feeling let down if he didn't call me. I rolled over in bed, searching for sleep. Before long, I had to admit to myself that if he didn't call, I'd be disappointed. And so I decided if Elvis wanted to see me again, I would say yes. Chapter 4. I woke late that Saturday afternoon and began thinking about the evening again. I had, of course, been enthralled with meeting Elvis. That was to be expected. This was Elvis, after all. However, he had been trying to connect with me, and after I saw how open and approachable he was, he had succeeded. Our age difference didn't even enter my mind, and I hoped I'd get the chance to try to get to know him better. Gathering with my sisters in the den, we talked about the evening's events. I ended our conversation musing. If I don't hear from Elvis, I'll write last night off as the most amazing night of my life so far. Around 8 p.m. the phone rang. My mother answered it in the kitchen, and I heard her say hi to George. I walked in and she handed me the phone. "Elvis would like you to come over," George said. "I'll drive by and pick you up." "All right," I said, and rushed to get ready. I wondered why Elvis hadn't called me himself, but it made me feel great that he'd actually been thinking about me and wanted to see me again so soon. George and I made small talk on the ride over to Graceland, where he led me straight upstairs to the master bedroom and left. I was just as nervous as the night before and could feel my heart racing. Elvis was sitting on his bed watching television. He wore a loose-fitting navy jumpsuit and a black rhinestone belt with chains. As he greeted me with a smile, I relaxed a little and thought with relief. So last night was real. Elvis got up and walked past the foot of his bed to turn off the TV, looking over his shoulder at me. "You know, television destroys the art of conversation," he said. This was an interesting observation, coming from a man who had at least one television set in just about every room. Returning to his bed, he asked me to sit beside him. I did as he requested, trusting him to be as gentlemanly as he'd been the night before. We talked a little about music. When I told Elvis that my mother often played hymns and that In the Garden and How Great Thou Art had always been two of my favorites, he asked me to follow him into his office. I was touched when he started playing the organ and sang In the Garden just for me. I had always admired Elvis's voice, which was so uniquely his. It could be soulful, tender, or powerful as he chose. Now, as Elvis sang softly to me, I felt calmed by the same peaceful, comforting feeling I'd had back home when listening to his gospel albums. Elvis knew how to reach inside you and touch your soul with his voice. Afterward, I followed Elvis back to his bedroom, where he began talking about a car he owned, a Ferrari that he nicknamed the Black Mamba. "I named it after the fastest snake in the world," he said enthusiastically, and then went into more detail about the car. I had never even sat in a Ferrari, much less ridden in one. When he brought up his car, I thought he wanted me to see it. "Can we go for a ride in your Ferrari?" I asked. "Not now," Elvis said. "I'll decide when we take a ride in it. That car is too fast for you." Ha, I thought. Little did he know how much I loved to speed down the highway on a motorcycle. I felt a little awkward at that moment, wondering if this was Elvis's way of letting me know he liked to be in control. A few books still lay on the floor beside his bed. Elvis reached for Cairo's Book of Numbers and seemed eager to pick up where we had left off reading the previous night. Going through books again wasn't what I had expected, but I thought it was interesting that he wanted to read together on a date. I felt a little less tense this time as we read to one another, and I found the subject of numerology intriguing. It wasn't something I thought anyone could understand right off the bat, but I was open to it. Elvis seemed to enjoy teaching, and I listened closely, trying to grasp the material. After we'd discussed the book a little while, Elvis changed the subject, bringing up another of his cars, a Stutz Blackhawk. He mentioned taking me for a ride in it over to Memphis Aero to see an airplane he owned. Memphis Aero was a part of Memphis International Airport for private planes. I grew excited as Elvis made a few phone calls, setting his plans in motion. He even invited some cousins along, which made me wonder whether Elvis, like me, sometimes needed a safety net, just like I relied on my sisters. When Elvis went into his bathroom, leaving me seated on his bed, I glanced about the room and observed more details than I'd taken in during my first visit. Antihistamine bottles, a box of tissues, and 2 telephones crowded his night table. A closed-circuit television monitor, its power off, was close by. I wondered again if Elvis had been watching my sisters and me the night before. I never would see it turned on, though. A television set with a Betamax tape player on top of it stood against the wall opposite the foot of the bed. To the left of that, a bookcase held a record player, radio, and some Betamax tapes. On top of the bookcase were a couple of framed photos of a woman I had seen in some movie magazines. I remembered now that her name was Linda Thompson. At that point in my life, I knew very little about Elvis's personal relationships, other than these facts: that he'd been married to and divorced from a woman named Priscilla, had one daughter, Lisa, from that marriage, and had dated various girls, Linda among them. Now I wondered why Linda's photos were still in Elvis's room. I didn't have time to wonder long. Elvis stepped out of his bathroom, now dressed in a coat, and said, "You know, last night while I was practicing karate, George came up to me and said, 'Terry is very nice, and Rosemary's very nice, but Ginger.'" He paused, shaking his head. Then Ricky came in later, saying, "Man, I think you're going to like Ginger." Elvis's voice was tinged with sarcasm as he went on. I told Ricky that I'd had a lot of girls brought up to Graceland in the past few weeks, and yeah, I'm sure I'm going to find someone I really like in Memphis on a Friday night. He then added that his cousin Billy's wife, Jo, had told him, "There's someone down here you are going to like." I was flattered by the attention, but slightly uncomfortable. I realized that my initial instinct about my sisters and me being scrutinized the night before had been right on target. It was after midnight by the time we went downstairs. A few people were waiting in the foyer, including 2 bodyguards and Gigi and his wife Patsy. We walked out onto the front porch, and I suppressed a gasp when I saw a car like none other I'd ever seen before. It was Elvis's Stutz Blackhawk, glistening in the soft glow from the overhead light. The car was black with chrome trim, exhaust side pipes, and wire wheels. It was so beautiful that I found myself wondering whether this was why Elvis hadn't wanted me to ride in his Ferrari first. Elvis opened the passenger door for me, pointing out that the trim on the dash and throughout the car was plated in 18-karat gold. Patsy and Gigi climbed into the back seat, and I slid into the red leather passenger bucket seat. Elvis got behind the wheel, started up the engine, and we proceeded down the driveway, with his bodyguards following in a car close behind. The streets were quiet as we rode toward the airport. It was about 15 minutes away, and as we neared it, Patsy suddenly suggested we take a tour over Memphis in Elvis's plane. "Let's fly over Nashville," Elvis quickly countered. I didn't say a thing. Taking a short flight in his private plane would be an extraordinary experience for me, not only because it was with Elvis, but because I had only flown commercial one other time at the age of 13. At Memphis Aero, Elvis's Lockheed Jetstar stood alone on the tarmac. Its interior lights were aglow, the door was open, and the steps were down, awaiting our arrival. I followed Elvis into the plane, where he introduced me to a pilot with the fitting name of Milo High and his co-pilot, George. As Patsy and Gigi took a seat on a lime-colored couch, I followed Elvis down the plane's small aisle, past yellow chairs facing each other, with small tables between them. Patterned fabric lined the walls near each window. I chose a lime-colored chair in the back, and Elvis's bodyguard sat nearby. I expected Elvis to sit down near me, but instead he turned around, walked to the front of the plane, and began speaking with Milo. After a few moments, he looked back at me and said, "I forgot something." Elvis headed out the door with his bodyguards in close pursuit. I suspected he had gone back to Graceland. Patsy and Gigi remained seated, and I stayed in my chair, the 3 of us making small talk. By the way they were acting, like this was any other ordinary night, and I got the feeling that this sort of impulsive outing with Elvis wasn't unusual for them. When Elvis and his bodyguards returned, he walked down the aisle with a mischievous grin on his face and sat down in the chair opposite mine. The plane's door closed and the engines fired up. As we began to taxi, Elvis announced that he had gone to get pajamas for everyone and we were all going to Las Vegas. Las Vegas? Pajamas? The thought of flying over Memphis or Nashville was one thing, but I had never been out west. Nor had I ever spontaneously left with anyone on a trip, never mind a man I'd just met. How long would it take us to get there? How long would we be gone? Where would I sleep? I was 20 years old, but suddenly felt like I was about 10. I wanted to call home to let my family know what was happening. When Elvis asked me if this plan was all right, what could I say? No, maybe, it's too far, stop the plane, I want to get off? Seeing Elvis's enthusiasm, I made an effort to hide my concerns. I simply smiled, answered yes, and allowed myself to be swept away to Las Vegas. I was silent as we took off and gazed out my window into the night, my mind racing. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see that Elvis was watching me. I glanced at him, and he quickly turned his head, looking out his window as if not wanting me to know that he had been staring at me. The cabin remained fairly quiet until a while into the flight, when Elvis looked over his shoulder toward Patsy and Gigi and said, "You know, I would like to see Ginger in new clothes and jewelry." Elvis stood up and took a few steps to the rear of the plane. He returned carrying a small, worn, black square case by its handle. Placing the case on the table between us, he sat down, opened it, and took out a long necklace made of black plastic beads with a cross at the center. "Lean forward, Ginger," he said, and gently placed the necklace over my head. "Thank you," I said. "Hold out your wrist and close your eyes," he said then. I felt something slip over my hand. Opening my eyes, I was shocked to see a gold identification bracelet on my arm with Elvis written in sparkling diamonds. "That's better," he said. "Now everyone will know you belong to me." As I thanked Elvis for these pieces, I felt stunned that he would give me gifts so early in our relationship, and unsettled that everything seemed to move so fast with him. I wondered if Elvis did this sort of thing with women on a regular basis, or whether he was serious about wanting me to belong to him. For my part, I felt suddenly special despite my anxiety. I was more excited than apprehensive, though, and falling in like with Elvis. Later, when I took the bracelet off, I noticed a date inscribed on the back and saw that he'd been given the bracelet in 1963. It wasn't until after Elvis passed away that I discovered he had worn this bracelet on stage and in private for many years, before generously gracing me with it as a token of his affection. Sandwiches were passed around, but I was too overwhelmed to eat. Shortly, the lights inside the plane were dimmed so everyone could rest, but I was keyed up emotionally and couldn't sleep. So I sat, eyes closed, wondering what lay in store for me. My concerns eventually gave way to excitement, however, the more I thought about seeing Las Vegas. As we neared the end of the flight, Elvis asked me to follow him to the cockpit. I did, and as I stood next to him behind the pilots, looking through the windshield at the lights below, I suddenly felt his arm slip around my waist. "Isn't it beautiful?" Elvis whispered in my ear. In the distance, what looked like an island of tiny, shimmering diamonds, surrounded by a sea of black velvet, slowly began to appear as we approached Las Vegas. "Yes," I replied, as it was truly breathtaking. We landed at the Hughes Air Terminal. As we descended the stairs from the plane, a dark-haired man in his late 30s greeted us. Elvis introduced him as Dr. Elias Guinan, his friend and personal physician. The two of us joined Dr. Guinan in his car, while Elvis's cousins and bodyguards followed in another. Riding through the streets of downtown Las Vegas, I felt like I was moving through a dream world. I was mesmerized by the city's endless, brilliant display of lights. I couldn't believe I was really there. We drove around to the back of the Hilton International Hotel, entered the building, and took an elevator up to one of the rooms. Elvis's bodyguards brought in a suitcase, and, after making sure things were secure, they left. I sat next to Elvis on the bed as he began chatting with his cousins and Dr. Guinan. I would later learn that Elvis and Patsy were double first cousins. Her father, Vester, who worked as a guard at Graceland's gates, was Elvis's dad's brother, and Patsy's mother, Cletty Smith, was Elvis's mom's sister. After a while, Patsy and Gigi left, and Elvis continued talking with Dr. Guinan. Their conversation eventually turned to vitamins. Elvis mentioned that he got vitamin B12 shots regularly. Understanding they were supposed to help give energy, I told him that my mother, on occasion, had gotten them from a nurse who used to be our neighbor. Dr. Guinan offered to give each of us a shot of B12. I'd never had one and was hesitant, but since he was Elvis's doctor, I trusted him. Not knowing what lay ahead and with no sleep to fuel me, I decided a little energy boost couldn't hurt. Elvis and I each got a shot in the arm. When Dr. Guinan finally left, I was expecting that Elvis and I would venture outside, but Elvis turned on the TV and settled down on the bed. "What about television destroying the art of conversation?" I nearly said, but I held back. I quickly learned that Elvis liked to joke around and talk about things on television. He had a quick wit, and we were having such fun that I didn't mind staying in the room after all. At one point, Elvis went into the bathroom and returned wearing blue pajamas. Just as I got my mind around the fact that Elvis was in pajamas, I realized that he held a matching pair in his hand. I hesitated as he held them out to me. The thrill of being in Las Vegas had taken my mind off some of my initial reservations about being in Elvis's hotel room, but now they quickly resurfaced. Shouldn't I be in a room of my own? I didn't want him to think I was as easy as that. Elvis handed me the pajamas and said, "Go ahead, put these on. You can change in the restroom." I was shy about wearing pajamas in front of a man I didn't know, and worried about how to handle what might be a too-soon sexual situation for me. Now that he'd given me the bracelet, would Elvis expect me to become intimate with him? I sensed Elvis was a good man, but I wasn't ready to be with him in that way. Putting on pajamas would definitely send the wrong signal. But what else could I do? I was alone with Elvis in a hotel room. I had to follow my instincts and trust him. Taking the pajamas, I walked into the bathroom and slowly began to undress, my fingers trembling a little. I had lost all track of time, and knowing my parents thought I was still in Memphis, I felt I should at least tell them where I was. I walked out and sat on the bed. "Is it all right if I call home?" I asked. "I need to let my parents know where I am." Elvis understood. I phoned our house, waking my mother. When I told her where I was, she was shocked, to say the least. I was filling her in on how the trip came about when Elvis suddenly motioned for me to hand him the phone. Confused, why would Elvis want to talk to my mother? I complied and gave him the receiver. Elvis began speaking with my mother, often calling her ma'am, which I found endearing. He seemed a bit nervous, actually stuttering a little as he assured her that he would take good care of me and see I got home soon. Handing me back the phone, Elvis settled under the covers and continued to watch television while I finished saying goodbye. When I hung up, he took my hand, and again I felt uneasy. Although I wasn't a virgin, I certainly wasn't about to leap into bed with anyone right away, even Elvis. My mind began to race for something to say, a way to explain my hesitation. but Elvis didn't make a move beyond holding my hand. I gradually relaxed and lay back beside him, watching television. He went to sleep holding my hand. By then, daylight was visible along the edges of the closed curtains in the room. Exhausted, I finally fell asleep beside him. Upon waking, Elvis ordered room service. Gigi brought in the food, laying a towel in front of us on the bed and placing trays with our food on top. Elvis sat cross-legged, and I followed suit as we ate, talked, and watched television. When I finished eating, I walked over to the curtains and pulled them aside to peek at the view. The lights of Las Vegas were shining brightly. Anticipating the prospect of experiencing the city, I went into the bathroom and changed back into my clothes. When I came out, Elvis was on the telephone, and I heard him arranging our return to Memphis. Had I done something wrong? I thought it would be rude to ask if we were going sightseeing, but to fly all the way here without seeing Las Vegas seemed odd. I tried making sense of it. Maybe he had to get back for work. Or maybe Elvis just did this at times, flying someplace because he relaxed better with the change of scenery. I may not have understood Elvis in those moments, but I consoled myself with the thought that at least I'd gotten a chance to spend more time with him. I'd flown on his plane and received beautiful gifts, and all the while Elvis had remained a gentleman. Reflecting on this, my disappointment about not seeing Las Vegas began to evaporate. We reconnected with his cousins in our room, and what had started as a Saturday night date for me lasted until our return to Memphis in the early hours of Monday, November 22nd. We drove back from the airport to Graceland, where Elvis asked me to stay for a while. I followed him up to his bedroom, where he sat on the bed, turned on the television, and began flipping through channels with a remote control. He stopped when a newscaster reminded us it was the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's death. Elvis talked briefly about Kennedy's assassination, thinking many were involved rather than there being a single shooter, and then he moved on to talk about self-defense. At one point during this conversation, Elvis leaned over the side of his bed and sat back up with a gun in his hand. It startled me. I hadn't noticed it on the floor before. My father owned a revolver and rifle at home, but I wasn't used to seeing a gun up close and out in the open like this. Elvis said it was a Colt .45 and proudly showed me his turquoise handle with the initial E on one side and P on the other. It's for protection, he explained, and told me about a threatening letter he had received once while getting ready to perform in Las Vegas. My daddy came to me one night with tears in his eyes, asking me not to go on, he said. I told my daddy, as a performer, the show must go on, so they tightened the security and I took the risk. Luckily, the letter turned out to be a fluke. Speaking of yet another incident during a Vegas show, Elvis told me about 3 thugs approaching him on stage and how he'd defended himself using karate. He laid the gun back on the floor, and I could only imagine how many other frightening experiences he'd had to deal with in the past. I appreciated him sharing these stories, and was newly aware of the fear he obviously lived with on a daily basis. I understood how that fear could bring him to a point where he felt in need of constant protection. The buttons atop a phone on his bedside table lit up then, and Elvis answered, listening with a concerned look. When he hung up, he told me the guard at the front gates, his cousin Harold Lloyd, said that the entertainer Jerry Lee Lewis had arrived in his car and wanted to see him. Jerry Lee Lewis? I was amazed. Much to my surprise, though, Elvis told me he didn't want to see Jerry Lee. He's a great piano player and performer, but I just think he's crazy, Elvis said. Getting the guard back on the phone, Elvis instructed him to tell Jerry Lee he was unavailable. I didn't get to meet Mr. Lewis in those early morning hours, but it had been one heck of a date. By now I was exhausted. When I told Elvis I thought it was time for me to leave, he surprised me again, asking, "Would you like to go on tour with me sometime?" I'd barely had a chance to absorb what I'd already experienced over the weekend, but I was thrilled by the offer and curious about what other new worlds I might experience with Elvis. Yes, I said at once. Elvis had singled me out, pursued me, and said things that made me feel special. Yet a small part of me still wasn't fully sure how he felt about me, because we were just getting to know one another. There had been no passionate kisses or heavy petting, and the fact that he'd been such a gentleman fueled my attraction to him even more. I thought Elvis was a fascinating man, and I definitely wanted to learn more about him. Before I left, Elvis kissed me lightly for the second time, another gentlemanly peck. I found it hard to say goodbye, because the word sounded final. Instead of saying goodbye, I chose to say, "I'll see you later," hoping in some strange way that this magic phrase might guarantee I'd see him again. And, for the rest of my time with Elvis, I never would say goodbye when leaving Graceland, because I always wanted to come back to him. Chapter 5. After that first exhilarating, overwhelming trip to Las Vegas with Elvis, I tried to resume my normal life. I slept briefly and went right back to work at the dress shop for a couple of hours that Monday afternoon and didn't tell anyone there about my weekend. After work, my friend Terry stopped by my house and we went for a drive in her car. By then I was about ready to burst. I couldn't resist telling her about my adventures. "You'll never guess who I met over the weekend," I said, deliberately trying to sound casual. "Who?" "Elvis." Terry slammed on the brakes, pulled over to the side of the road, and refused to drive until I'd recounted how my sisters and I had met Elvis. Needless to say, she was blown away. I didn't blame her. I still had a hard time believing any of it was real myself. I then went on and told her about our Las Vegas trip. I didn't hear from Elvis Monday night. By early Tuesday morning, it was all over the news that Jerry Lee had been arrested outside of Graceland. He had returned in the early morning hours and nudged the front gates with his Lincoln, demanding to see Elvis with a Derringer .38 pistol in his possession. As I listened to the news, I remembered Elvis's comments regarding Jerry. Maybe Elvis had been right not to have seen him that night. I wondered what Elvis had been thinking when Jerry returned. Wednesday evening rolled around without any word from Elvis. It had only been a few days, but I wondered why he hadn't called. He had seemed to want to see me again after our time together in Las Vegas, and he'd certainly acted like I was special to him with all of the things he had said and done. From his affectionate behavior toward me, I would have thought Elvis might have at least called to say hello. After all, I was the proud owner of a bracelet with his name on it, and he had declared, "Now everyone will know you belong to me." My doubts began to swirl as I wondered whether he'd really meant the things he'd said to me. Was it possible that maybe I was placing more value on our time together than he did? I hoped not. When Larry, the man I'd been seeing for a few months, telephoned me at home that night, I was thrown into another emotional tailspin. Whether it was my doing or not, things had changed for me. The past weekend had been completely mind-blowing, and I hadn't gone one day without thinking about Elvis. I needed to be honest and upfront with Larry, so I asked him to come over that night. I knew that telling him about Elvis and my sudden change of heart would catch him as off guard as it had me, and I felt bad about that. I didn't know if Elvis would even call me again, but I was willing to wait and see. Larry and I talked for a while. Afterward, he still wasn't ready to accept that I wanted to end things, and he left expressing the hope that we could sort things through. I had gone about my normal schedule, worked at the dress shop, and otherwise spent time with my family, but I hadn't gone out in the evenings, wondering if Elvis would call. My family had been stunned by the bracelet Elvis had given me. I was so afraid of having it fall off my wrist that I didn't wear it often. I only looked at it in my bedroom, still surprised that Elvis had given it to me. It seemed to have been something special to him, and yet I hadn't heard from him. When Thanksgiving came and went, and all day Friday too, without a call from Elvis, I truly felt that something wasn't right. I must have misinterpreted what had happened between Elvis and me. I was just going to have to wake up and return to my real life. On the Saturday after Thanksgiving, a man called our home. He said he was Elvis's road manager, Joe Esposito, and he asked to speak with me. My mood immediately lifted as Joe told me Elvis was on tour, would be in San Francisco, and wanted me to fly there and see his show. My initial reaction was one of enormous relief. That's why I haven't heard anything, I thought. He's been on tour. I even rationalized that maybe this road trip was the reason why we had left Las Vegas so soon. In the middle of arranging things with Joe, I suddenly heard Elvis's voice come on the line. "I need you out here with me, Ginger," he said, and added with a chuckle, "Get your ass out here." I was so glad to hear his voice that I simply said, "Okay," even though "get your ass out here" wasn't exactly the way I thought I'd be invited. It wasn't the sort of language I was used to hearing. I was momentarily taken aback, but my excitement kicked in, and I decided to overlook it. Elvis wanted me to join him on tour. Elvis then asked if he could speak with my mother. "I want to ease any worries she might have about you traveling to see me," he said. My mother and Elvis spoke for a few moments. Then Elvis put Joe back on the line to finish discussing travel arrangements. Joe told me to be at Memphis Aero at 10:30 that very night. Tonight? Panicked, I hung up and quickly began to pack. I had no clue what to wear and felt nothing in my wardrobe was right. Thankfully, Terry came to my rescue and generously loaned me a couple of nice outfits she'd received from her pageants. It was a brutally cold, snowy night in Memphis, and my parents were worried about me traveling in those weather conditions. Just as I finished packing, Milo High, Elvis's personal pilot, called to say that the door to the Jetstar was frozen shut. "We're not sure we can open it," he admitted. He also told me they had to wait for the runways to be cleared and the plane to be de-iced. After the anticipation of seeing Elvis and all my rushing around, I sat in our den and anxiously wondered if I'd even be making the trip at all. A few hours later, Milo finally called back. "We're ready for you, Ginger," he said. My mother asked me to call when I arrived in San Francisco as I left with my father for the airport. The Jetstar was waiting for me on the edge of the runway. I said goodbye to my dad and hurriedly boarded the plane, already feeling the bitter wind seeping through my coat. It was so cold inside the plane I could see my own breath. Milo and George greeted me when I boarded and handed me a blanket. As we took off and began our journey west, I reflected on how, once again, I was experiencing things with Elvis that I'd never done before in my life, leaving Memphis alone for the first time and going to another city I'd never seen before to be with a man I hardly knew. I felt a shadow of trepidation creep over me. I suddenly wished my sisters or a friend could have accompanied me, so I wouldn't feel quite as alone. I lay across the couch, pulled the blanket up around me, and tried to sleep, knowing I'd need my energy for whatever adventures lay ahead. We landed in San Francisco a few hours past midnight on what was now Sunday, November 28th. I rode with Milo and George to a Hilton hotel, where they helped with my suitcase and escorted me to my room. The first thing I did was place a collect call to my parents to let them know I was okay. Then I started unpacking. I didn't know if Elvis would have a show that afternoon or evening, but because he had arranged my travel, he must have surely known of my arrival. I was certain I'd get a knock on my door or a phone call shortly. I was really looking forward to seeing him. The minutes ticked by. I began to feel tired from the thrill of the trip, the anticipation of seeing Elvis again, and being awake for so long, especially since I was still running 2 hours later on Memphis time. I tried to fight sleep by watching television. A couple of hours went slowly by. It was getting closer to dawn, but still feeling like I was on call. I was reluctant to wash my face, put on pajamas, and crawl into bed, only to have Elvis knock at my door. So I stayed up, letting a few more hours pass. Finally, feeling silly, I decided Elvis was asleep, and I should get some rest. I gave up and went to bed. I woke that afternoon around 3 p.m., feeling better but still a bit jet-lagged. Positive that I'd hear from Elvis any minute now, or at least from someone who'd give me information about a show, I took a quick shower and hurriedly got dressed. I hurried for nothing, as it turned out. More time passed. Even if Elvis had performed last night and had not gotten to sleep until early morning, he must have been up for a while now because it was after 4. Why hadn't I heard from him? Again, I tried to rationalize what was going on. Since I'd arrived so late, maybe Elvis was letting me sleep, I thought. I hadn't eaten since leaving Memphis and began to feel hungry. Suddenly I realized that, in all of my excitement and rushing around, I hadn't brought any money with me. I'd never been in a situation like this. I didn't feel right taking advantage of Elvis by calling room service. I wondered if I should leave the room and try to find a member of his staff, but I was afraid to leave for fear of missing Elvis or a phone call from one of his employees. Feeling more awkward by the minute, I continued to watch television as the hours marched by. It was bizarre, being whisked out of Memphis and then having to wait around like this without a word from anyone. I didn't really feel angry at Elvis because he clearly had wanted me to see his show enough to bring me here. I was happy that he'd asked and excited about seeing him. But as day turned into night, I was starting to feel abandoned and confused. Where was Elvis? The phone finally rang around 6 p.m. I leaped to answer it, excited that someone had finally remembered I was here. It was one of Elvis's employees asking if I needed anything. When I told him I was hungry, he said, "Order anything and charge it to the room." Then he hung up with no mention of Elvis or where he was. Was Elvis's location a secret? I felt completely baffled. I still had no idea what was going on. At that point, though, I was just relieved to know I could be eating soon, and so I ordered room service, another new experience for me. It wasn't until late that night, after 11, that there was finally a knock on my door. I figured it had to be someone associated with Elvis, or maybe even Elvis himself, so it would be safe to open the door. A man in his early 30s stood there. He had mid-length, dark, shaggy hair and introduced himself as Jerry Schilling. "You're going to be moving to a different room," Jerry announced, then quickly walked away. I closed the door, more bewildered than ever. A different room? Why? Things had happened slowly up to now, so I figured I had plenty of time to pack. I sat back down to watch more television. A few minutes later, however, another sharp rap sounded at my door. Already? I opened it, and Jerry was back, this time accompanied by Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. Joe was shorter than Jerry, in his late 30s, with a compact build and a dark receding hairline. While the two men waited in the hallway, I quickly threw things into my suitcase. Joe and Jerry then led me on a long walk to another section of the hotel. When we reached what I thought was my new room, Jerry opened the door and gestured for me to enter. I was surprised to see Elvis inside, sitting on a couch in the center of a suite and dressed in a hooded blue terry cloth robe. He was surrounded by men. Our eyes locked and my heart did a little skip. All of the hours of waiting and uncertainty were worth it. I was thrilled to see him. At the same time, I felt uncomfortable walking into this room full of men. I'd always been shy with men, and even though I knew I'd been inspected during my first time inside Graceland, the scrutiny was even more intense when I entered this room. Elvis seemed at ease. He stood up with a smile and walked over to give me a hug, then turned to the group of strangers and began introductions. The men in the room included Larry Geller, his hairdresser, a lean man in his late 30s, Billy Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother, in his 20s, and an aide, Ed Parker, a strongly built Hawaiian man in his mid-40s with thick silver hair who had trained Elvis in karate, Dr. George Nicopoulos, late 40s, Elvis's silver-haired physician, Dean Nicopoulos, the doctor's son, and Al Strada. Dean and Al were both in their 20s and working as Elvis's aides along with Billy. Finally, I was introduced to an overweight man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair named Lamar Fike. No job was mentioned for him at the time, so I was left to wonder if he was employed by Elvis too, or simply visiting. Elvis took my hand and led me into the suite's adjoining bedroom. He didn't explain why I hadn't heard anything or seen him until now, but I didn't care anymore. My feelings of confusion and abandonment had vanished the minute I saw him. Books were scattered everywhere, on top of his bed, on the floor, and spilling out of the suitcases. A few looked familiar. They dealt with the same topics I remembered seeing in his bedroom at Graceland, including religious philosophy and numerology. Seeing that most of the books had to do with spirituality, I realized for the first time that Elvis truly was on a serious personal quest. We sat on his bed and talked for a little while about my trip, what he'd been reading, and this and that. He told me that he had a show the following night, and I wondered if he'd had one tonight. Elvis wasn't interested in talking about his shows, however. He wanted to look through some of his books. As we continued to sit together, Elvis began reading to me, pointing out phrases he had underlined on well-worn pages, some of which had loosened and were falling out of the bindings. Seeing that he had even written notes inside some of the margins, I understood this wasn't just casual reading for Elvis. He was studying these books in detail. I admired the fact that he was hungry for knowledge. Elvis had left the bedroom door slightly ajar. After a time, I noticed some of the men I'd met earlier still seated in the living room. Could these be normal hours for all of them, Elvis included? It was now well after 1 in the morning. The past times I'd been with Elvis, I had thought he was staying up late only because he was off work and enjoying himself. I began wondering if maybe the late-night hours provided the only time Elvis could truly feel relaxed and find some peace because the rest of the world was asleep. We talked until the early morning hours. When the two of us were both exhausted, Elvis told me I had a separate room adjoining the living room suite. Still the gentleman, he escorted me across the now empty living room and said he would see me later that afternoon. With another light kiss, he headed back toward his own bedroom. I entered my new larger room and saw that my suitcase had been placed inside. I opened it, took out pajamas, and walked into a generous bathroom wallpapered in a paisley print, noticing a telephone attached on the wall above the toilet. The phone wouldn't have meant much to some, but this was my first time in such a lavish hotel suite, and I was tickled by the small touch of luxury. I soon settled in bed, marveling at how my life could change so quickly. Between the trip and the anxiety that had mounted while I was waiting to hear from Elvis, I was bone-tired. My head had barely hit the pillow when I fell into a sound sleep. I was jolted awake at 4 p.m. by a loud knock on my door and a voice announcing, "Breakfast." A little late for breakfast, I mused. But then again, I was in Elvis's world and living in the Elvis time zone now. I jumped up, quickly dressed, put on some makeup, and entered the suite's living room. Elvis's bedroom door opened and he joined me, still wearing pajamas and a blue hooded robe. For the first time, we actually sat together on a couch instead of a bed. One of Elvis's aides spread a towel across the coffee table and placed 2 plates of Southwestern omelets, bacon, coffee, and juice in front of us. The television was turned on, and Elvis and I chatted as we ate. Shortly, some of the men I'd met the night before began filtering into the room. Given the fact that every man there wore the same gold necklace with the TCB lightning bolt emblem, I guess they had to be part of a special group associated with Elvis. I hadn't spent much time alone with Elvis, but now I had the opportunity to witness more of his sharp sense of humor as he lit up a cigar and began joking around with the guys. He found some of the things on television amusing and made funny comments as he surfed through various channels. As the other men laughed along with him and the conversation became increasingly animated, Elvis's conversation was peppered with curse words. I thought this must be his way of talking around the guys since, except for an occasional foul word here and there, I hadn't noticed him speak this way before. Later, as our relationship grew, I learned to overlook the choice words Elvis used at times, although I'd never be 100% comfortable with them. Elvis and the men continued to pal around with one another while I ate quietly. When I finished, I stood to go to the bathroom. Elvis grabbed hold of my hand, startling me. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Just to wash my hands," I replied. "Oh, okay, hurry back," he said. I was pleased and flattered. Elvis had been so engaged in conversation with his entourage, I'd thought he wouldn't even notice if I slipped out of the room for a few minutes. Apparently, though, he was still focused on me, and my presence was important to him. As the time for Elvis's show drew near, he went into his bedroom to get ready while I dressed in mine. By the time I returned to the living room, there was a buzz of activity. Various aides, along with Elvis's hairdresser, physician, road manager, and bodyguards, were all rushing in and out of his bedroom. Before long, Elvis stepped out of his room wearing a white jumpsuit with varying shades of blue and a rainbow pattern swirled across the front of his suit and down the sides of both pant legs. His hair was styled to perfection. He wore a matching belt with chains around his waist, and his feet were clad in white leather boots. Seeing him dressed in one of his stage suits up close like this, he looked so handsome, it took my breath away. While some people gathered around to finish preparing him to go on stage, Elvis glanced over at me with a faint smile, placing his hands on his belt and shifting it up a bit. He raised an eyebrow at me and gave me a slightly worried look. I couldn't believe Elvis was showing a hint of anxiety before a performance after so many years. That endeared him to me even more. I mouthed the words "very nice" to him from across the room, wanting him to know that I thought he looked great. Surrounded by Elvis's entourage, we finally left the room and walked down the hotel corridor. Elvis grew quiet. I could tell he was focused on his upcoming show. We took the elevator down to the hotel's ground floor. Outside, a couple of cars and a limousine were waiting for us with a police escort. I had never been in a limo, so climbing into one of these cars was yet another novelty for me. I scooted into the center of the back seat. Elvis sat beside me. Some of the other men crowded in with us, while others piled into the second car. I sensed that Elvis was still anxious about his performance. He stared pensively out of the window during the short ride, occasionally making small talk, or kidding someone, but speaking softly. He explained this by whispering to me. I'm protecting my voice. Upon our arrival at the Cow Palace Arena, a huge indoor arena in Daly City, everything warped into hyperspeed. We immediately exited the car, and Elvis was rushed into a dressing room. I was escorted past backstage hands onto the floor of the arena and told to wait by the stage. The arena looked full, and there was a comic named Jackie Kahaney already performing on stage. I would later learn that he had been Elvis's opening act for the past 6 years or so. I stood alone and felt extremely excited, but a little scared, too, as I waited for someone to tell me what to do or where to go. Reflecting on the only other Elvis concert I'd seen, back in July with my mom and sister, I thought about how lucky I was to be here right now, about to watch his show from the perspective of a guest instead of one more ticket holder. Eventually, Dean Nicopoulos approached and handed me a soft drink, then brought over a steel chair, explaining it was for me. Elvis wanted the chair placed right on stage behind his soundman. It felt great that he wanted me this close to him. Just make sure you head for the limo at the start of his closing song, Can't Help Falling in Love, he warned. Otherwise, it might be tough to get you out of here when the fans rush the stage at the end of the show. My heart beat faster as I was assisted onto the stage. There I met soundmen Felton Jarvis and Bruce Jackson as I sat down. Jackie Kahaney did a great job of warming up the crowd. As Jackie's routine wound down, a thrill of anticipation began to ripple through the audience. I was feeling this excitement too, but on a much more intense personal level. I wasn't just going to watch Elvis, the performer, tonight, but a man who made me feel special and was beginning to stir feelings in me. I really wanted to see Elvis do well. Finally, the lights slowly dimmed as musicians and singers walked onto the stage and took their places. Screams erupted from the audience as the orchestra began playing Elsa sprach Zarathustra, better known as the theme music from the motion picture 2001: A Space Odyssey. Elvis's on-stage entrance was greeted by thousands of flashing camera bulbs. The flashes blinded me momentarily and gave the arena's interior an eerie strobe light effect. Like a magnet, Elvis drew all eyes to him as he assertively strode back and forth across the stage to grant everyone the best chance to see him and take photographs. Elvis then approached Charlie Hodge, who helped place the strap to a guitar across his shoulder and moved to the center stage microphone. There he began playing his guitar, belting out C.C. Ryder with great passion, volume, and timbre. His iconic voice boomed out over the arena, immediately bringing many in the audience to their feet. Throughout the concert, Elvis genuinely seemed to be having fun. He joked with the crowd, his musicians, and the background singers. Charlie sang harmony, played rhythm guitar, occasionally handed Elvis a glass of water, and was quick to place a fresh scarf around Elvis's neck after one went soaring from his hand out into the audience. Sitting on stage so close to him, I found it alarming to watch how the fans tumbled and climbed over one another in a heated competition to grab a scarf. I was afraid one of them might get hurt. As I watched Elvis perform, real time seemed suspended. He'd been on stage for well over an hour when the band started to play Can't Help Falling in Love. With a start, I suddenly remembered Dean's warning about being in the limo before the song ended. I stood up and prepared to leave. Suddenly, the word "stay" resounded through the speakers. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Elvis momentarily point at me while continuing to sing. I couldn't believe that he was immediately aware that I was leaving. I sat back in my chair, embarrassed, wondering if anyone else had picked up on this. I could only hope the dim lighting in my corner of the stage had made it impossible for anyone in the audience to notice me. I grew increasingly nervous as the seconds ticked by, worried about how I'd make it to the car in time. Finally, when I saw Elvis walking to the opposite side of the stage, I jumped up and ran off, still a little fearful that he'd notice I was gone. The last thing I wanted him to think was that I didn't want to hear his closing number or appreciate the effort he'd gone to in order to bring me here. The limousine was waiting at the end of an underground ramp, its engine running, its doors open. Someone led me there, and not a moment too soon, for suddenly Elvis came rushing toward the limo, surrounded by members of his entourage. He hurriedly climbed into the car, drenched in sweat, with the towel draped around his neck. His bodyguards, Dr. Nicopoulos, Joe Esposito, and a few others quickly joined us. Good show, Joe congratulated him, as Elvis leaned back in the seat, wiping his face with the towel. Others began complimenting Elvis as well. I finally jumped in. You were wonderful, I said. As the limousine slowly began moving forward, Elvis leaned toward me and softly asked, Did you see the very end of the show? No, I admitted. I was told to be in the car before the last song finished. I saw a flash of annoyance darken his face. Be sure Ginger remains seated until the very end of the next show, he announced to everyone in the limo. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. I was going to see another one of his shows. Fans mobbed the limo as our car emerged from the building. It was a scary feeling to be surrounded like that, with some fans even trying to climb on top of the limo. I took hold of Elvis's hand. Elvis, however, seemed calm. He was clearly accustomed to this sort of thing. He waved to his fans and joked with me about buying a plastic arm with a hand attached, so it would look like he was still waving while resting his own. I couldn't help but think about the early Beatles movie, A Hard Day's Night, and the shots in that film of their fans chasing after them. Wait a minute, I thought. Elvis must have experienced that long before they did. I didn't see how anyone could ever completely get used to this kind of attention. Back at the hotel, Elvis went into his bedroom with his aides and Dr. Nicopoulos. I went into mine. After the men left, Elvis asked for me and ordered room service. I walked into Elvis's bedroom and was surprised to see him already dressed in pajamas and a robe. I couldn't blame him for wanting to get out of his stage suit and into more comfortable clothing, but I was still surprised by the pajamas. It wasn't that late at night. Various other members of his staff entered the room, and our food was soon brought to us. While we ate, Elvis began scrutinizing his performance. I saw how important a top-quality show was to him as he went over everything, the band, the lighting, the sound, and the audience experience. He didn't want to disappoint his fans in any way. As we sat there and talked about the show, it dawned on me that I had entered Elvis's suite at around the same time the previous night. Elvis had been dressed in his robe then, too, and surrounded by these men. Had he finished a show last night? And if so, why wasn't I invited? It wouldn't be until after Elvis's death that I would learn the real reason I had been left sitting in my hotel room for a day. Linda Thompson had been in the hotel, and Elvis was ushering her out with one hand and me in with the other. What Elvis wanted, Elvis got. For many around him, this was taking care of business. After the guys left, Elvis told me that his tour would finish the following evening in Anaheim, California. You'll stay, won't you? He asked. Of course, I said, thrilled by the invitation to see another of his performances. Once we'd settled that, Elvis picked out a book to read. After entertaining thousands of his fans, he seemed to need a way to focus his thoughts and turn everything off. A feat I imagined couldn't be easy, especially for a man who loved performing as much as Elvis did. We read together for a long time. Elvis always put intense philosophical thought into interpreting what he felt various authors were trying to say in their books. This exercise was helpful to me because the books themselves weren't easy to understand right away. I felt like I was in the presence of an interesting teacher. I began to get sleepy after a time, but I did my best to stay focused, feeling it was important to Elvis. Around dawn, an aide brought in a small yellow packet and left it on the night table. Elvis swallowed its contents with water from a nearby ice-filled jug. I was instantly alert and curious. "What's that for?" "Something to help me sleep," Elvis said. He had been deeply absorbed, even energized, by the different books we'd been looking over, so I didn't think twice about him needing to take something to help him sleep. Although it was morning by now, I told him good night. Once again, he walked me to my room like a gentleman. For some reason, I didn't sleep long, probably because of the combination of jet lag and the strange reverse schedule Elvis kept, turning day into night and night into day. When I got up around 1 p.m., it was quiet in the rest of the suite. I figured Elvis was still asleep because we'd been up so late. I hadn't really eaten much dinner, and now I was hungry. I felt more comfortable about ordering room service, so I did, eating alone in my room, as I contemplated this intriguing new world I was inhabiting. There was Elvis's lifestyle and dynamic personality to think about, along with his music, his religious studies, and the many people who seemed to surround him 24/7. It was intense, exhilarating, and exhausting, as I tried to process everything and understand where I was in all of this. I didn't yet think of myself as the one, though Elvis seemed to be doing his best to make me feel like I was special to him. If he wanted our relationship to go further, I decided I was ready. Finally, around 4 p.m., someone knocked on my bedroom door. I opened it to find Elvis standing there in his pajamas and robe, a sight I was beginning to think of as normal. "I'm going to order us food," he said. When I confessed that I'd already eaten, it seemed to bother him. "From now on, I'd like us to eat together," he said. "I'm sorry," I apologized. I had no idea Elvis would be sensitive about that. At the same time, I was pleased that he'd said "from now on," which indicated he was certainly seeing a future for our relationship. I wanted to fit in however I could. On tour with him later, whenever I happened to be in my room when breakfast was brought in, Elvis would knock on my door, take my hand, and lead me to the coffee table or his bed so we could eat together. Before long, Elvis's food was brought up to him, and we sat together in the living room while he ate. He told me he was going to perform in Las Vegas right after this tour and asked if I would like to go with him. "I'll be there for 10 days, he said. I loved watching his shows and was excited by the prospect of spending more time with him. I was concerned, though. I'd only brought enough clothes for what I thought would be a short visit. Could I really go from California to Las Vegas with him? And what about my job? How could I just not show up for 10 days? As I was thinking about the logistics, the men in Elvis's entourage began showing up one by one. What was quickly becoming a familiar scenario ensued. Elvis joked around and smoked while everyone laughed along with him. After Elvis's death, I would learn more of the personal history Elvis had with some of these men, who, unbeknownst to me at the time, had been dubbed the Memphis Mafia by the media. I left the living room to place a call to Memphis, letting my parents know I wouldn't be coming home for a while. It was unusual for me to be away from home for so long, and it felt good to hear their familiar voices. At the end of our conversation, my mother mentioned that she had spoken to her father, my grandfather, whom I was close to, about me traveling with Elvis. Being 85 and old-fashioned, my grandfather had expressed concern as to whether this was proper. "Tell Elvis she's my girl," my grandfather had said. I understood how someone from his generation might have concerns about what I was doing. I figured my parents did as well, because I seemed to be moving headlong into an uncertain future. I had my own fears. I didn't want to fall in love only to get my heart broken. On the other hand, Elvis's magnetism was pulling me closer and closer to him by the day. I asked my mother to call the shop where I worked. "Please explain what's happening," I told her, wondering whether I'd still have a job when I came back from Las Vegas. I couldn't worry about that right then, though. My focus now was on being with Elvis. I wanted to do that more than anything in the world. The rest of my life could wait. As we prepared to leave for Anaheim, I began to pack. I knew I was totally unprepared for Las Vegas, but what could I do? I closed my suitcase and walked into the living room, thinking I'd just have to manage with the clothes I had. Elvis soon joined me, having changed into his casual navy blue jumpsuit. During the ride to the airport, Elvis fell into what I was starting to see was one of his frequent habits. He propped his right foot on top of his left knee and began to nervously shake it. I was tickled to notice he hadn't really changed clothes at all, for the edge of his pajama bottom was sticking out from beneath the pant leg of his jumpsuit. A huge passenger jet waited for us at the airport. Until then, I'd had no idea Elvis owned another plane. His daughter's name, Lisa Marie, was written in blue on the upper front of the aircraft. High up on the tail was a picture of the American flag, and below that appeared the letters TCB in gold above a gold lightning bolt. As we walked up the stairway to the door of the plane, Elvis told me he had picked out the color scheme himself. The first time I showed it to my daughter, Lisa, she just yawned, he said with a grin. A flight attendant greeted us. I also met the rest of the crew and the pilot, Captain Elwood David. I thought the captain's name was a cool coincidence, since my father's middle name was Elwood, and this was the only other time I had heard it. The jet start certainly impressed me, but the Lisa Marie was magnificent. The main compartment of the plane was furnished like a living room, with 2 suede couches, 1 green, 1 brown, leather chairs, leather top tables, and even television sets. As I followed Elvis deeper into the plane, we passed a large conference table surrounded by tan leather chairs and entered a sitting room furnished with blue suede chairs. Finally, we entered a bedroom. Decorated in blue, it had everything you could want, a queen-size bed, a reading chair, and even a dressing area with a half bath and blue wash basin. I stayed in the bedroom with Elvis while the others took seats up front. During the short flight, Elvis proudly continued telling me about the plane's various special features. After landing, some employees began entering the bedroom to help Elvis prepare for his show, so I moved up front. When Elvis finally walked out, he was dressed in a beautiful jumpsuit with an ornate Native American feather design. We were soon off to the Anaheim Convention Center, where, once again, I found myself seated on stage behind the soundmen to watch the show. This time I was mindful about remaining in my chair a bit longer. It was fantastic to be so close to Elvis when he performed. Sitting on stage really pulled me into his show. I felt lucky to be so completely in the moment with him, following his every gesture, comment, joke, and glance. As the song Can't Help Falling in Love drew to a close, the band's drummer kicked in and Elvis began doing impressive karate moves, which ended with him crouched in a long, low stance, one leg bent and the other extended. He looked quickly over at me and smiled. I smiled back, realizing this was what he'd wanted me to see. Having been a fan of karate as a child, I loved seeing it on television and in films. I could tell Elvis must have studied it for years to be this proficient. I wouldn't have traded being where I was that minute to be anywhere else, or with anyone else. When the show was over, I hurried to catch the limousine, almost bumping into Elvis as we exited the theater. Safely inside the car, he said he was happy I'd seen his finale. Good show, Joe declared once again as the car sped away from the building. Back aboard the Lisa Marie, Dr. Nicopoulos and some aides walked to the back of the plane with Elvis and closed the bedroom door. As I followed behind them, I noticed that many of the same people were on the plane with us, along with some new faces. Al Strada walked out of the bedroom carrying Elvis's boots and stage suit. He'd left the door partially open. Through the crack, I could see Elvis, half-clad in his casual navy jumpsuit, standing with his arms in the air and out to his sides. I was amused to see Dean scrambling around him, zipping up his suit and putting socks on his feet. Elvis saw me watching and motioned for me to enter the bedroom as Dean and Dr. Nicopoulos left. Walking toward him, I noticed the zipper tag to his suit was flipped upward. Deciding to place the finishing touch on his change of clothes, I quickly flicked the zipper down with my finger. I was stunned when Elvis reached out and grabbed my wrist. "Don't do that again," he said. "I've been trained to guard against sudden moves." I believed him for a second. Then Elvis broke into a smile, and I saw he was joking. Still, after seeing his karate moves on stage, I believed Elvis would have been perfectly capable of taking someone down if the need arose. Elvis sat on the edge of his bed, and I took the chair beside it. As the Lisa Marie took off, Elvis opened his suitcase and removed Cairo's book of numbers again. By then I understood enough from our readings to know that the point of this numerology book was to help people use the power of numbers to predict the future using things like birth dates. Now Elvis turned to a page I hadn't seen yet. On this page, Cairo described how people should wear certain colors and carry lucky stones according to their numbers. As we talked about colors and their meanings, Elvis was reminded of a story his father had told him about the day he and his twin brother were born in Tupelo, Mississippi. While my mama was in labor, Elvis said, my daddy went outside our home to get water from the well. When Daddy turned around, he noticed a blue light above our house. Daddy rushed back in and found out my brother Jesse was stillborn. Then I was born. Elvis spoke with reverence, as if the blue light represented God's relationship to him and his own understanding of the path his life had taken. Vernon's story initially sounded far-fetched to me, but still, it gave me chills. I wondered if Elvis really believed the story, and decided from his tone that he most likely did. Reflecting on where Elvis had come from and who he had become made me wonder if he really had been chosen by God. Since I had been brought up in a Christian family, I believed the miracles described in the Bible to be true. I felt Elvis was a strong Christian because of his love of gospel, and if he didn't see a conflict with this way of thinking, I felt there wouldn't be a conflict in my beliefs as well. I was determined to keep an open mind, feeling that maybe God does touch each of us in different ways. I do believe certain things like that can happen, I told Elvis now, speaking as solemnly to him as he had to me. At that moment, Elvis pulled off one of his socks to show me his right foot. His second and third toes were joined together at the bottom, a physical attribute he called twin toes. I think being a twin was the cause of it, he joked. When I laughed, Elvis gave me a long look and said softly, "You know, Ginger, I feel like I've known you for a long time. When I first saw you, it was like a siren went off inside me saying, 'Back, whoa, back, boy, find out what she's like.'" As Elvis told me this, he placed one hand over his heart and raised the other in the air as if trying to halt something. "Seeing you was like seeing someone I've always known and yet never known," he went on. "I kind of see my mother when I look at you." Too surprised to speak, I wondered if he was talking about how I looked or how I acted. Either way, I was deeply touched and took this as a compliment. Elvis turned his attention back to Cairo's book without waiting for a reply. He'd made these strong statements so casually, yet so sincerely, I couldn't help but ask myself whether I felt the same way. As if I'd known him for a lot longer than the few days we'd spent together. The answer had to be yes. When I met Elvis that first night at Graceland in Lisa's bedroom, I was the one who had greeted him first. Something deep inside had made me feel instinctively comfortable enough to do so. After a short while, Elvis mentioned he needed to talk some business and called a few others to the back. I left the room to give them privacy and waited just outside the bedroom door. The other passengers on the Lisa Marie were conversing with one another. Several were playing cards or other games. I definitely felt like the new girl in town. I squared my shoulders, took a deep breath, and deliberately walked up front to introduce myself, then tried to join the conversations. Charlie Hodge weaved in and out of the main room with a cocktail, telling jokes. Dean shouted, "I'm the king," after making a good move in backgammon, a game I had never heard of before. There were a few other women on the plane as well. Some of them wore gold necklaces with the letters TLC, similar to the TCB necklaces a lot of the men had. Soon I would learn that TLC stood for Tender Loving Care. These necklaces were gifts from Elvis, given to his family, friends, and a few select others. I had introduced myself to a couple of people, trying to make headway, when someone approached to say Elvis was asking for me to return to his room. I did so, hoping that at least I'd made the first step in trying to get to know the insular group surrounding Elvis. Chapter 6. After landing in Las Vegas, we climbed into a waiting limousine and were escorted by police to the Hilton International Hotel. As we passed by a large, glitzy marquee displaying Elvis's name, I mused on the fact that I'd never been to Las Vegas before in my life, and now I'd been here twice in a short time. Once again, we entered the hotel through the back door, but this time rode the elevator to the 30th floor. I followed Elvis down a hallway toward a security guard sitting in a chair beside some double doors. One of the doors was opened. We walked through it and down a few steps into the living room of a penthouse. It was a sumptuous suite, decorated with gold carpeting and drapes. Black pillows accented the gold sofa and chairs furnishing the living room. There was a dining room and kitchen, too. I'm sure I must have looked as awed as I felt as I gaped at our new surroundings, because Elvis was watching my reaction and smiling. From the main part of the enormous suite, he walked me down a short hallway and into a master bedroom. There were his and her bathrooms, a sitting area, and a king-size bed on a raised platform. The mirrored ceiling above the bed reflected our movements. An aide entered the bedroom, opened a suitcase containing books, and laid a few on the floor beside the bed. Another aide placed a water container on the night table, along with a box of Roytan cigars, the brand Elvis had occasionally smoked in front of me. The aide also left a schedule on the nightstand listing which employees were on duty and at what time, along with their room numbers. By now I had observed that the aides seemed to have various assignments. Some helped with wardrobe, while others served as extra hands during concerts or brought food and packets of medication to Elvis. Once they'd made sure everything was to Elvis's liking, the aides evaporated. No sooner had they left when Elvis pressed a button by the bed. The drapes against one wall slowly began to open, revealing windows and a spectacular view of Las Vegas spread below our penthouse. Elvis gave me a tour of the other rooms connected to the suite and mentioned that his father was coming and would be staying in one. I wondered which bedroom would be mine, after noticing Joe Esposito in one of them. Telling me that his dad, Vernon, had suffered a heart attack the year before, Elvis said he was glad Vernon was able to come to his shows again. We returned to the living room, and Elvis walked over to a record player. The song he chose to play was Charles Boyer singing Once Upon a Time. As the song echoed throughout the suite, Elvis closed his eyes and began to speak the lyrics Boyer style. He continued to do the same with the song Softly I Must Leave You. The words were beautiful, and I sat, enchanted, as Elvis delivered them with great passion. When the album ended, Elvis told me that Softly I Must Leave You was written by a man in a hospital who began to feel like he was dying after his wife lay beside him and fell asleep. Not wanting to wake her, the man wrote the words to the song in a letter to his wife. I knew this song had touched Elvis deeply, as I recalled him singing and talking about it on stage the first time I saw him perform back in July. Elvis would play this album many more times for me while we were in Las Vegas. With no show until the next evening, Elvis had time to relax. I followed him into the bedroom, thinking we might rest, but he stayed up as various employees popped in and out, some going over business, and others just checking to see if he needed anything. Dr. Guynham stopped by to say hello, making me wonder what had happened to Dr. Nicopoulos. When Elvis wanted to speak to one of his staff privately, he'd sometimes gesture to the bathroom door and jokingly say, "Step into my office." I decided it made sense. The bathroom was private and more convenient for him than going to an outer room or asking others to leave. When things quieted down and we were finally relaxing in bed, Elvis picked up a book. This time it was The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese philosopher and artist. I didn't know it yet, but during the intimate months we would spend together, Elvis would refer to this book many times. It was an important philosophical touchstone for him. Elvis turned the book over and showed me the author's photo on the back cover. "Doesn't he have a knowing look?" he asked. I took in what seemed to be a pensive Gibran and answered, "Yes." The prophet spoke of a person named al-Mustafa, who was waiting to return home after living 12 years in the city of Orphalese. With sadness, he answers questions from the people of the isle before he departs. Elvis singled out some quotes and read them to me. One of them came from a section where al-Mustafa is asked to speak of love. "When love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. And when his wings enfold, you yield to him, though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you. And when he speaks to you, believe in him, though his voice may shatter your dreams, as the north wind lays waste the garden. For even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Even as he is for your growth, so is he for your pruning." Elvis read the words with great passion and power. I could sense that he really wanted to grasp what the author knew or how Gibran had been feeling in order to write this way. For my part, I listened to the words and felt my own inexperience in relationships. At age 20, I had yet to know a truly great love. Would Elvis be my first? After sharing these passages with me, Elvis explained, "I don't think a person can control love. When it happens, you just go along with it and try your best to be prepared for the good and bad." And when al-Mustafa is asked what of marriage, Gibran wrote these words, "You were born together, and together you shall be forevermore. You shall be together when the white wings of death scatter your days. Aye, you shall be together even in the silent memory of God. But let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of the heavens dance between you." At one point during this reading, Elvis paused to smile and say, "I think I could be engaged to you," then returned his attention to the book. I was no longer concentrating on the book. I was too flabbergasted. Engaged? Had I heard Elvis right? I decided he was joking, saying this just because we happened to be reading together and enjoying ourselves. We'd only been together in all about a week. Still, his statement hung over me as Elvis continued to read, emphasizing certain words and shaking his head in amazement at their power. I thought the writing was wonderful, too, and found myself going over quotes and asking questions while Elvis analyzed different passages from the book. Even in such a short time, I could feel that reading with him was helping me learn and grow. A little while later, Elvis paused again and shut his eyes. "You know, when I close my eyes, I can envision you in a long white gown," he said. Then he slowly opened his eyes, cocked his head to one side, and raised an eyebrow at me, gauging my reaction. "Oh," I said, struggling to think of some reply. "That's nice," I added and smiled. "A long white gown? Engaged? Is it possible he means what I think he means?" This can't be right, I thought, not after such a short time. On the other hand, I'd already seen how spontaneous and decisive Elvis could be about certain things. I had certainly felt a strong attraction between us from the first day we met, but the idea of us already discussing marriage was nearly impossible for me to grasp. I was just 2 years out of high school, and we couldn't have been at more different places in our lives. Yet these potential obstacles seemed to be rapidly fading. Also, it was no small thing that this was Elvis, a man who seemed to live in a world of his own making. Without remarking on my shocked expression, which I'm sure must have mirrored my thoughts, Elvis simply smiled and went back to reading. Meanwhile, my mind continued spinning out of control. How could Elvis feel so strongly about us already? As dawn broke, Elvis went into his bathroom and changed into pajamas, with no mention of a separate room for me. Realizing there would be little to no privacy now, I decided to just go with the flow and went into the designated ladies' bathroom to change for bed. Not only did I still have to work on feeling comfortable wearing pajamas around Elvis, I now had to be okay being dressed in them, chances were, in front of his entire clan of male pals and support staff. I came out of the bathroom and sat beside Elvis on the bed. I had been trying hard all evening to understand and accept the ideas and information he'd been sharing with me. Now he sprang something new yet again. "Come on, let's meditate together," he said. "It's calming and a way of being in touch with one's higher self." I had never meditated and had no clue what he meant by a higher self. Still, I was willing to try it. I sat beside him and crossed my legs, imitating his position. Pyramids possess a special energy which help give strength to an individual, Elvis explained, as he showed me how to form a pyramid shape with my index fingers and thumbs. Then he placed his hands up to his forehead and told me, "Pray to the third eye and say, Christ light, Christ love, Christ peace." After I'd repeated these words, Elvis explained that the third eye was an energy center that related to being able to evaluate our past experiences and life patterns so we could put them into perspective through the wisdom of the third chakra, which was located between the eyes. If this chakra malfunctioned, the symptoms might be a headache and eye tension. We sat in this position, and I tried to focus on blocking out everything else as I repeated these words with Elvis. To my surprise, after a while, I felt a peaceful feeling wash over me. I could definitely understand how someone like Elvis, with so many demands on his time and energy, could benefit from meditation. Elvis looked relaxed when we'd finished meditating. He told me that when his ex-wife, Priscilla, was speaking with him on the phone once and telling him that she didn't know how to handle Lisa, he'd said, "Get a pen and a piece of paper and write down this word, meditate." He had yet to make any physical advances toward me, other than the light kisses I'd received. I wasn't really surprised by this, given his schedule. But now, here we were, in another hotel room, and he wasn't exhausted from a show tonight. Would he make a move? And what would I do if he did? There was no need for concern. Elvis took 2 cotton balls and put them in his mouth to wet them, then placed a cotton ball in each ear. This helps to block the outside noise, he explained. He was clearly preparing for bed. It seemed that Elvis was as eager to respect me as I was to be respected. He purposely kept his distance from me, and I got the feeling that he was saving our physical encounter for a time when it would be right for both of us. We started watching television, and after what had been a long, exhilarating night, we both soon fell asleep. When we woke again, an aide brought in a packet for Elvis and left. Elvis told me it was a mixture of vitamins, medication, sinus pills, and aspirin. I figured this was a combination designed to give him the energy and clear head he needed to perform. We then went into the living room and ate, visiting with some of his entourage. When his karate instructor, Ed Parker, appeared, Elvis referred to him as his high priest. Elvis had explained to me earlier that Ed was a martial arts expert. Ed had trained many stuntmen and celebrities, and Elvis had hired him to help with security. "My previous bodyguards kept getting into trouble and causing problems for me," Elvis said, "so they had to be fired." This was the first time I'd heard Elvis talk about karate with Ed, and Ed's knowledge was extremely impressive. Now I learned that it was Ed who had promoted Elvis to a 9th-degree black belt. Elvis told me that he didn't want the rank of 10th degree because there was nowhere to go after that. He wanted something to aspire to in karate. Early in the evening, Elvis asked me to go shopping. "I want you to look special for my shows," he explained. He asked a bodyguard to accompany me. I understood that Elvis felt responsible for my safety, but I felt a little uncomfortable shopping with a strange man and having Elvis buy me clothes. On the other hand, I was sure that appearances had to be important to Elvis, and I didn't want to disappoint him. The Hilton had some beautiful shops downstairs. I browsed inside a few stores while the bodyguard waited just outside them. We were going to be in Las Vegas quite a while, and I didn't know what to buy. Conscious of not spending too much, but wanting to get something that pleased Elvis, I finally decided on a pair of silver and rhinestone evening shoes, a smoky gray cocktail dress, a peach gown, and another white evening dress with long sashes. The bodyguard paid for everything, and we returned upstairs. Elvis was in the master bedroom when I returned, sitting on the bed and still in his pajamas. "Let's see what you got," he said. "Try them on for me." Feeling shy again, I ducked into the bathroom and slipped into the white dress. I paused for a minute in front of the mirror, hoping Elvis would be pleased. When I walked out, a big smile flashed across his face, and I felt a mixture of pride and relief. "I love it," Elvis said. "You look like a Greek goddess." Feeling more confident now, I quickly tried on the other dresses, and he complimented those as well. I sensed the white one had been his favorite, though, and decided to choose that one to wear for his opening show. I put my new clothes away, and, since Elvis was in pajamas, changed back into mine as well. I might as well get used to wearing them, I decided, since he appeared to live in his. Elvis handed me one of his robes and picked up Cairo's book of numbers. I followed him into the living room, taking a seat beside him on the sofa. Elvis had earlier told me that his number was 8. Now he pointed out passages about certain colors of stones that, according to Cairo, were lucky for those who were a number 8 to wear. One of these stones was a black diamond, so he'd had that stone placed in a few of his rings. "I lost one of the rings, and another got broken when I slammed my fist on the floor during a show," he said. Listening to him talk about lucky numbers and stones, I sensed that Elvis felt a strong desire to feel protected both on and off stage, not just physically, but psychologically and spiritually as well. Elvis stood up and went back into the bedroom, then returned with a magnificent ring I'd seen him wear during his performances. Proudly rotating the ring in his hand to catch the light, he told me it was custom-made of gold with black onyx. The center stone was an 11-carat diamond. Below it, the letters TCB were in diamonds, surrounded by diamond lightning bolts. "I wear band-aids on my fingers while performing to guard against cuts," he said, "and so no one can pull my rings off." Then he asked, "Did you notice how, on stage, I keep a side stance when I bend over to accept a gift or give a kiss?" "Yes," I said. "Why is that?" "So nobody in the audience can pull me off the stage." As Elvis began talking about his upcoming shows, he seemed a little more nervous about these than he had about the previous ones I'd seen. "I'm not being judged by just the general audience here," he pointed out, "but by my peers as well." At one point, Larry Geller walked into the suite. He hesitated, silently signaling to Elvis, "Should I stay or go?" Larry wanted to color Elvis's hair, a fact that shocked me. I had no idea that Elvis's hair color wasn't natural. Looking slightly annoyed, Elvis dismissed Larry and asked him to come back the next day. The interruption made Elvis change the subject. Now he brought up the theory of soulmates. He believed two people could be fated to be soulmates and play certain roles in one another's lives. "They're meant to meet and be part of a larger, inevitable picture," he told me. This was the first time I'd ever heard of this concept. I was intrigued, but I wondered why Elvis was mentioning it to me. I thought back to his earlier comments about being engaged, envisioning me in a white gown, and me being like someone he'd known and yet never known. Was Elvis thinking that we could be soulmates? Again, I experienced conflicted emotions, wanting to believe Elvis thought I was special in his life, while at the same time trying to protect myself against being hurt. Our conversation continued, alternating between numerology and delving deeper into Elvis's thoughts about soulmates. I learned as we talked that Larry was the one who'd given him most of the books we'd been reading. Deciding he wanted to learn more about soulmates now prompted Elvis to ask an aide to contact Larry, hoping he might have some books on it. Larry reappeared almost immediately, eager to speak with Elvis. However, seeing that Larry didn't have a book with him, Elvis spoke to him briefly and Larry left. We continued talking through the night, with the notion of soulmates and a possible future with Elvis swirling through my mind. Near dawn, Elvis took the contents of a yellow packet that once again had been left on his night table. I noticed the word sleep written on the outside of it. This was only the second time I became aware of Elvis needing help to get to sleep. I hadn't noticed any packet the previous morning and assumed he'd gone to bed without any medicine. After taking the sleep medication, his speech began to slow down as it took effect. I hadn't noticed this before. Shortly, Elvis lay back in bed, and I helped pull the covers up around him. I rested my head on the pillow beside him and reflected on the things we'd read and talked about for the past several hours. His powerful belief in certain things like numerology and fated soulmates was persuading me to broaden my horizons beyond the traditional Christian beliefs of my childhood. Our dialogue had also shed more light on how Elvis saw the two of us through the filter of what he was studying. That he saw us as possible soulmates was a profound thing. That next afternoon, I met Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, for the first time. Vernon was 61 years old and close to Elvis's height, 5 feet 11 inches according to Army records. But Vernon was thin and frail-looking. His hair and mustache were both silver, but I could see the strong resemblance between Elvis and his father. Vernon entered the suite with an attractive blonde in her 30s. I learned that Vernon and Elvis's stepmother were no longer together, as Vernon introduced the woman as his fiancée, Sandy Miller. Vernon and Dee Presley had been separated since 1974. Sandy was a divorced lab technician and nurse from Colorado. Elvis spoke with Vernon about how things were going, and I could tell that Elvis took his father's opinions and thoughts to heart. Vernon was pleasant to me, but he didn't say much, understandably focusing his attention on his son. After Vernon and Sandy left, Elvis asked Larry to come in and color his hair. Closer to showtime, Elvis invited Joe into our room and wanted to speak with him in private. I stepped into the living room to give them time alone. After a few minutes, Joe reappeared and left the suite. I thought Elvis would ask for me, but instead Joe returned, went back into Elvis's bedroom, and hastily exited the suite again. Joe did this a few more times. When Elvis did finally call for me, no sooner had I sat down beside him on the bed when Elvis got up and walked into the living room. I was completely mystified. Then Elvis returned to the bedroom once more, sat across from me on the bed, and asked me to close my eyes and hold out my right hand. I did as he asked, trembling a little with nerves by this time, and felt him slip a ring onto my finger. Opening my eyes, I saw that he'd given me a gorgeous gold and diamond cluster ring. I was trying to wrap my mind around this generous gift when Elvis asked me to hold out my other hand. This time he placed a ring of sapphires and diamonds onto my left ring finger. "Here," he said cheerfully, "you have to have backups." Bringing one hand from around his back, he proceeded to give me 2 more rings. One of them was set in rubies and diamonds, and the other was a second diamond cluster ring. "Man, this one reminds me of my birthday," Elvis said, pointing to the free-form diamonds on the ring. "They're set in the shape of the number 8. Any one of these rings was more than I'd ever been given. I was speechless and overwhelmed. I felt that all of Joe's comings and goings must have had something to do with Elvis putting him in charge of securing the rings. It was all too much, and I felt slightly awkward. I didn't want Elvis to feel like he had to do this. Hesitantly, I tried to explain this to him. "Elvis, these rings are beautiful, but I've never really been a jewelry person." Undaunted, he said, "This is only the beginning. You'll learn to like it." "Okay," I agreed. "I guess I will." Chapter 7. While Elvis got ready to go on stage that night, I went into the bathroom and made my own transformation. I changed into my new white gown and buckled the straps on my rhinestone shoes. I placed my new rings on 4 of my fingers, still amazed that Elvis had thought to buy them, and managed to pull off such a huge surprise with everything else on his mind. Finally, feeling much like Cinderella, after her fairy godmother has waved her magic wand, I walked into the living room and discovered a few other women waiting there. They were dressed more casually than I was, and I worried that I had overdressed. I was afraid this would alienate them, and I really wanted to fit in. "You're wearing what Elvis likes," I reminded myself. I had to admit, I liked it too. A thin young woman with short blonde hair introduced herself as Shirley Dew, Joe Esposito's girlfriend. I didn't get a chance to speak with the other women there, however, as one of the aides appeared and quickly led me downstairs to the Hilton showroom. Once again, I was awed by the splendor of my surroundings. The showroom was absolutely beautiful, with chandeliers, a large stage, and stylishly dressed men and women in the audience, some of them sitting in curved red booths. I was escorted to a center booth, where I took a seat beside Vernon and Sandy. As the opening act concluded, and the lights dimmed, I was shocked when someone approached our booth, stuck out a piece of paper, and pinned toward me for an autograph and said, "Priscilla?" How odd. Did I look like Elvis's ex-wife in the dark? I wondered. Vernon immediately shooed the fan away with his hand. The Joe Guercio Orchestra began to play, and Elvis walked on stage wearing a King of Spades jumpsuit. Right off the bat, he had the audience captive in the palm of his hand. This was a much smaller venue than I'd ever seen him perform in before, and the show felt more intimate and personal. Elvis joked around with the audience, and they felt comfortable enough to yell back at him, making comments and requesting songs. Elvis was clearly enjoying the interplay with the audience and seemed to be in great spirits. At one point, he introduced the actress Vicky Carr, singer Glenn Campbell, and Vernon. When he sang Softly I Must Leave You, I remembered the story he'd told me about the dying man lying next to his wife and got chills. Despite the smaller, lush setting and designer clothing and expensive hairstyles, these fans were only slightly less exuberant than the fans at the Cow Palace. They seemed to have the same uncontrollable need to make physical contact with Elvis. At various times, women in elegant gowns actually lifted their dresses and began climbing over tabletops, hoping to get close enough for a kiss or one of Elvis's scarves, but they were stopped by security. Children were thrust onto the stage, too, and Elvis never failed to notice, immediately connecting with them. He had a big soft spot for kids. When the show ended, Vernon, Sandy, and I were ushered into a backstage dressing room, while Elvis changed in an adjoining room. I sat quietly on a couch while Vernon and Sandy greeted people. I didn't think I'd see Elvis until he'd finished visiting with everyone, but after a few minutes an aide made his way through the crowded room, leaned over, and told me that Elvis wanted me with him. Once again, I felt a thrill at being singled out. As I followed the aide into the adjacent room, I saw Elvis seated and in deep conversation with the singer Glenn Campbell and his wife Sarah. After being introduced to Glenn and Sarah, they continued the conversation they'd been having about the science of numbers and various other topics. I listened carefully and was able to reflect on what Elvis had discussed with me over the last few nights. I was actually surprised that what was brand new to me seemed to already be something of real interest to another person in the entertainment field. Thinking and talking about these alternative beliefs didn't feel threatening to me. Elvis was just deeply curious about life in general, and wondering why his own life had turned out the way it had. Spending time with Elvis often felt like taking a philosophy course, making me open up and consider new ideas. Despite my interest in the conversation, at one point my thoughts momentarily drifted to the people waiting to see Elvis in the next room. He'd been talking with Glenn for quite a while. I wondered if any of the other people would get tired of waiting and leave. When Elvis and Glenn finished visiting and we stepped into the outer room again, however, it was still crowded. Elvis took time to greet all of those waiting for him. He was generous that way. And then we finally returned to the suite, where at last I got a chance to tell Elvis how much I had enjoyed his show. Elvis ordered room service while his father and Sandy came in to visit. Vernon gave a curt, candid appraisal of the show. I would later feel that, when it came to his performances, Elvis seemed to value his father's judgment above that of all the other men around him. At one point, Elvis mentioned to Vernon, "You know, Daddy, Lisa's coming in." As Vernon smiled, Elvis proudly added, "And Ginger, I want you to meet her." "I'd love to," I said, looking forward to it. Once Vernon and Sandy had gone, an aide appeared, laid a towel on the bed, and placed a tin-foil pan full of lasagna in front of Elvis. It was a large amount, not portioned out. I wondered if he was intending to eat the whole thing as Elvis sprinkled it with salt. Ed Parker and a few other members of Elvis's entourage came and went. As the men were talking, I sat quietly and noticed Elvis salt the lasagna again. Caught up in visiting, he didn't take a bite, but ended up salting the food several more times. When he finally took a bit of lasagna, of course it was cold. Elvis sent it back to be reheated. When the food was brought back, I knew it had to be extremely salty and worried about how that might affect Elvis's health. Luckily, he didn't eat much of it. Late into the night, we were finally alone. As Elvis picked out a book to read and we settled back against the headboard of his bed, he asked, "Do you know what a Ferrari looks like?" "No, I'm not exactly sure," I admitted, thinking he must not remember telling me about his black Mamba. "If you were me and you were going to buy a new car, what kind would you get?" he asked. I was flattered he wanted my opinion, but had no idea what kind of car he might like to drive and didn't dare guess. "Well, it depends what you want," I hedged. He pondered this thought for a few seconds, then said, "I don't know. I need your help." I took a deep breath, considering. "A Cadillac or Continental would be nice," I ventured. "What color?" he asked at once. "Blue or white would be pretty," I said. A hint of a smile passed over his face. "Thanks, Ginger. I've just been thinking about getting a new car lately." Then we went back to reading. I continued to be impressed by Elvis's zealous spiritual appetite. Despite the long day and the energy he'd expended on stage, followed by talking with people for hours, Elvis was still on a spiritual high. He got energized as he read. Whenever he came across a new idea or had a fresh thought about something we'd found in a book, he would discuss his thoughts and ideas with me, even at the expense of going to sleep at a normal hour. Aren't you tired? I asked at one point. He shook his head. It's much better to think at night, when the air is still and others are sleeping, he said. Most writers and geniuses work best at night. I didn't know any writers or geniuses, but this certainly seemed to be true for the man I was starting to have strong feelings for, so I continued to read with him. As dawn approached, an aide brought in a yellow packet and placed it on the night table. These packets were routine, I realized, delivered in the same casual manner as the jug of water at Elvis's bedside. He placed a cotton ball inside each ear again, took the packet of medication, and went to sleep. I fell asleep beside him. A few hours later, I felt movement. Elvis was awake. Who's on duty? He asked. Can you call whoever it is for me? I could tell by his voice and the way he was moving that Elvis was still groggy from whatever sleep medication he'd taken. I quickly looked at his employee contact list sheet and called the room number of the person on duty. An aide entered, assisted Elvis to the bathroom and back, as he was a little unstable on his feet, then left. This was unsettling for me to witness, yet the aide had treated it as completely normal. Elvis went back to sleep almost immediately, but I lay awake, wondering how long he'd been taking this medication and why he needed it. Because it was delivered in little yellow packets, I had no idea what he was taking, but it seemed quite strong. I thought, too, about Elvis's padded bedroom doors and covered windows at Graceland. I felt a sharp pang of sympathy for him. Elvis seemed to have everything, except the ability to do what most of us take for granted. Just close his eyes and peacefully fall asleep. Elvis wanted me by his side nearly every minute. I was his primary focus and he was mine. Still, I often felt like I'd been transported to a foreign country where I had yet to understand the language or customs. Getting to know the average person is one thing, but trying to understand Elvis, his job, and the many different people who surrounded and supported him was a steep learning curve. The best analogy I can come up with is that Elvis, at work, was like a champion athlete, competing in an event each day, with trainers, doctors, and staff keeping him in performance-ready shape. I would often feel tired from not getting a full night of sleep, but gradually I was starting to adjust to his schedule and to being surrounded by other people. Most of the people working for Elvis were friendly to me, but a little distant. They were doing their jobs rather than just visiting. It was now Friday, December 3rd, and I discovered that Elvis would have 2 shows on weekends, one at 9 p.m. and the other at 1 a.m. It said something about his stamina, I thought, that he had the energy to do both. We woke around 4 in the afternoon as usual and ate in the living room, while members of his entourage visited off and on. A little while later, Elvis was in his bathroom, and I was sitting on the bed when the phone on the night table rang. I waited to see if anyone might answer it from an outer room, but the ringing continued. Finally, I picked up the receiver. Hello? Is Elvis there? A woman asked. Yes, but he's busy right now, I said. The woman then inquired, Is this Ginger? Yes, I replied, my curiosity aroused. Who is this? This is Linda Thompson. Do you mind if I wait? I was shocked. Linda Thompson? Why was she calling him now? And how did she know my name? No, it's fine, I said, and put down the receiver. Dr. Guinan walked into the room just then, and I told him Linda was on the phone. He went to the bathroom door, knocked on it, and stepped inside. Elvis emerged from his bathroom, looking none too pleased. Feeling ill at ease, I left the bedroom to give him some privacy and walked into the now empty living room, my thoughts whirling. I began to wonder if Elvis had seen Linda recently. I hoped not. I didn't want to be in the middle of anything. Dr. Guinan walked out, and Elvis called my name from the bedroom. When I entered, he looked bothered and said, Sorry about that call, then asked me to sit beside him on the bed. Linda and me, that relationship's been over, you understand? We're friends, he said. In recent years, I'd seen some magazines with photos of Elvis with various women and accompanying stories that he was dating them, so I thought he was being honest and hadn't gone out with Linda in a while. If he had, maybe it was just his friends. Still, I couldn't help but remember Linda's pictures in his bedroom at Graceland. Okay, I said, but my guard was up. Elvis must have read the closed expression on my face. You know, my bodyguard Sam is Linda's brother, he said. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable with that, okay? I hadn't known, but that explained how Linda knew my name. Outwardly, I agreed, but I knew this would be awkward, not only for me, but for Sam. Accepting the situation would be more easily said than done. Showtime was nearly here. The bedroom was abuzz, with members of Elvis's staff helping him prepare. Once he was dressed, he saw me watching him use eye drops. They help keep the glare down from the stage lights, he explained. I sat with Vernon and Sandy to watch his first show, unable to fully enjoy myself because I was still feeling emotionally unsettled by Linda's call. When Elvis sang a song called Trying to Get to You, I focused on the lyrics, one line in particular. There were many miles between us, but it didn't mean a thing. In a way, I thought that song related to the two of us, with the miles being our age difference of nearly 22 years. We were trying to get to know each other, Elvis and I, and our age difference didn't mean a thing. I relaxed and listened to him sing this song, which quickly became one of my favorites. Between the hot stage lights and his jumpsuit, Elvis perspired a lot when performing. During this show, the sweat constantly dripping from his brow irritated his eyes. Afterward, he quickly visited with a few people backstage and then hurried to our suite, where he lay on the bed. "Will you help me, Ginger?" he asked. He wanted me to dampen a washcloth so he could place it over his eyes. I did so, sitting beside him and gently laying the washcloth across his brow. I was happy to feel needed and useful even in this small way. From then on, after some performances, we had a ritual of me sitting on the bed and putting a warm, wet washcloth over his eyes to give him comfort. Elvis rested for a while, then ate something before returning downstairs for the second show. When Elvis's performance ended, I was escorted backstage, but instead of going to his dressing room, Elvis asked me to follow him. I did, my curiosity on fire, along with a few people from his entourage. We followed Elvis out one of the hotel's back doors. There, gleaming beneath nearby lights, was a brand-new white Lincoln Continental Mark V with white leather seats and a burgundy dashboard. Elvis walked toward the car and everyone gathered around it. I was still confused about why this car was here or what we were doing. Then Elvis looked at me and nonchalantly said, "It's yours, Ginger." To say I was overwhelmed doesn't even begin to describe the enormity of my emotional reaction. I had never even owned a car before, and now I had a Lincoln Mark V? I hugged Elvis hard, my heart brimming with gratitude, as I suddenly realized that our conversation the night before had absolutely nothing to do with him wanting to buy a car for himself. There weren't any white Lincoln Continentals in Las Vegas, Elvis told me proudly, so we located one in California and had it driven to us. Stunned, speechless, awed, there weren't enough words in the world to tell Elvis how I felt. All I could say was, "Thank you." I was excited to test drive my new car, but Elvis turned to go back inside. I didn't know Las Vegas, understood he must be tired, and was okay with following him back up to the penthouse. I was still reeling with excitement. Once we were back in the suite and seated in bed, Elvis asked me, "Have you ever been married before?" "No," I said, a little surprised by his question. "Were you seeing anyone before we met?" he pressed. I answered, "Yes," momentarily thinking about Linda's phone call. I wondered if that was what had prompted this conversation. Elvis thought about this for a few moments, then said, "Well, I would like it if you wouldn't see anyone else." He was seriously asking for a commitment. "I won't," I said, certain that Elvis meant he wouldn't see anyone else either. It felt good knowing that we were now taking this to a different level. Elvis surprised me again by picking up the phone receiver and handing it to me. "I want you to call whoever you've been seeing and end your relationship with him." I knew the object of my affection now was Elvis, but this put me in an awkward position. Although I had spoken to Larry about Elvis, he had still held out hope that we'd get back together, and I knew finalizing our breakup over the phone would hurt him. This would be insensitive, and I didn't want to hurt someone who had been nothing but nice to me. I owed it to Larry to do this in person. "Elvis, I can't do that right now," I said. I started to explain this when suddenly Elvis's mood changed. For the first time I saw that he had a hair-trigger temper as Elvis picked up a full bottle of Gatorade from his night table and stormed out of his bedroom and into the middle of the suite. I followed him, completely stunned, into his road manager's room. In front of Joe and his girlfriend, Elvis took the Gatorade container and threw it against the wall, its contents splashed all over. Shocked and embarrassed, I again tried to explain my feelings. None of this made any sense. I had never meant to anger him. Joe and his girlfriend didn't have a clue about what was going on. I wasn't sure either. I realized for the first time that if Elvis and I continued our relationship, it would most likely be played out in front of his entourage and, at times, in the public eye. I was also going to have to come to terms with the fact that others might speculate about me and about my relationship with Elvis, without fully understanding what was going on with us in private. Could I live with that? I had to, if I wanted to be with Elvis. Joe said a few words to Elvis, and between the two of us, we managed to calm Elvis down after a few minutes. I followed Elvis back into the master bedroom, where he shut the door and remained silent as he got into bed. I tentatively sat down beside him, wondering why he'd gotten so angry. Had this been a big misunderstanding? Had he misinterpreted me saying, "I can't do this right now," to mean I wasn't going to commit to him? Was it simply because I hadn't done what he wanted when he asked? It troubled me that Elvis had flown off the handle like that, and I was still reeling a little with embarrassment. As odd as this sounds, it also made me feel good to think that Elvis was really that serious about us. But how could I be sure? What Elvis did next made me believe he felt as deeply about me as I did about him. Without saying a word, Elvis suddenly leaned in and kissed me on the mouth, but not a light kiss like before. Then he slowly began removing my bathrobe. I felt chills as he touched me. Was this it? Were we finally going to make love? I was aroused but anxious, barely able to breathe. I had been afraid of letting go of my feelings, terrified of being hurt by sleeping with Elvis and then have him move on to someone else. But at this moment, I wanted to make love with him. I stayed completely still, letting Elvis open my robe and begin touching me. "I don't believe people should be completely undressed until they're married," Elvis said softly, kissing me again. Then, still partially dressed in our sleepwear, Elvis and I made love for the first time. This crazy tension and our heightened emotions made our intimacy all the more intense. Elvis's lips were soft and his kisses were filled with passion. He was gentle, yet I felt his determination to prove that he should be the only man in my life. He succeeded. I was experiencing emotions and physical sensations that were completely out of control, and in keeping with Elvis's TCB motto, it was all happening lightning fast. There was no doubt about it. I was falling in love with Elvis. Chapter 8. Making love with Elvis helped forge an even deeper emotional bond between us. I felt like I was completely his in every way possible. I no longer had any control over my feelings for him. In our brief time together, Elvis had already turned my sleeping and eating patterns upside down, and almost everything else in my life as well. Now things were rapidly moving beyond any normal frame of reference for me, and all my intuitive guideposts were falling by the wayside. The new normal for me was that there was no normal. The very next afternoon, Elvis and I eagerly awaited his daughter's arrival. Now 8 years old, Lisa had been living in Los Angeles with her mother since her parents divorced in 1973. Having the two of us meet, I felt, was one more way for Elvis to bring me into his life. I was sitting beside Elvis on the sofa in the living room when the door to the suite opened and a petite blonde-haired girl came in, followed by a nanny. Lisa's resemblance to Elvis was uncanny. Elvis and I stood up as Lisa ran toward him and they hugged. He introduced me to her and we sat back down. Lisa was seated between us, but she remained completely focused on her dad. It was clear that she adored him. At one point, Lisa accidentally rested her hand on my knee and glanced my way, but was quick to turn her attention back to her father. I enjoyed watching Elvis with her. His face really lit up around Lisa, and I sensed he was a caring, proud dad. At one point, Elvis looked at me over Lisa's head and said, "When Lisa was born, I heard my mother's voice say, 'She's beautiful, son.'" I loved children as well and had been an aunt since I was 10 years old, so I was happy to have Lisa with us. When it was time for Elvis to prepare for his first show, Lisa and her nanny went off to her room, and I left for my bathroom to get ready. In the middle of applying my makeup, I looked in the mirror and was startled to see Lisa's reflection. She had been standing behind me and silently watching. "Hi," I said, and turned around to smile at her. "Hi," Lisa said, then sat down and began trying on some of my shoes. I didn't mind. I was glad that she seemed to be so comfortable with me. Then she surprised me again. "I thought you were Linda," Lisa said, glancing up at me. It was an innocent remark on her part, yet I was suddenly aware that Lisa may have gotten close to some of Elvis's former girlfriends. I was a new face in Lisa's life, and we both needed time to get used to each other. "Well, I'm not Linda," I said gently, and went back to the business of putting on my makeup, chatting with her a bit as she continued playing. I may not have gotten a tour of glittering Las Vegas yet, but that didn't stop Elvis from bringing more sparkle to me. Disregarding what I'd told him about not really being a jewelry person, he surprised me with a beautiful diamond and emerald necklace before his next show. That was followed shortly by the gift of another diamond necklace and a diamond watch. When I told him, "This is really too much," he shook his head. "People love to see beautiful things when they wake up," he said. I felt this was an insight into Elvis's thinking. He saw himself as someone who was in a position to enhance other people's lives by bringing beauty into it because he thought that would make them happy. He was not only a generous man, but he had a fundamentally generous and kind spirit. He wanted to make life better for those he touched in all ways that he could, both through music and in his everyday life. He was a giver in the most decent way, not a taker, and this was one of the things that drew me to him. Elvis wanted me to wear all of my jewelry at the same time for his shows. Although I did feel regal, I also felt overdressed. I wasn't used to this. I reminded myself that I was with Elvis and needed to dress in a way that complemented his style. In the showroom, Lisa sat with Vernon, Sandy, and me. Elvis came on stage, dressed in a beautiful Inca gold leaf jumpsuit, and I wondered what was going through Lisa's young mind as she listened to her father sing. She must be so proud, I thought. Fans yelled out various requests during that show, as they so often did, and Elvis did his best to give them what they wanted. Elvis's audience may have begun to age, but they wanted him to remain timeless and perform the moves that had made them fall in love with him. As a showman, he was a perfectionist with a keen ear. Any time he heard the smallest thing that didn't sound quite right, feedback from a microphone, a strange noise, an off note, Elvis would stop, apologize to his audience, and usually start over. That night, Elvis introduced Lisa and his dad to the audience, prompting a large stage light to sweep across the room and settle on the two of them. Smiling, Lisa stood up and Vernon waved. The singers Roy Orbison and Engelbert Humperdinck were there, and Elvis acknowledged their presence as well. He was in a jovial mood, joking with his band and trying on various hats handed to him by members of the audience. I sat in wonder, struck by what a charismatic performer he was. One moment, Elvis would be delivering an electric musical performance. The next, he was playful and flip, using humor to segue from one song to another. Charlie, always ready with lyric sheets, handed one to Elvis before he sang Bridge Over Troubled Water that night. It was a lengthy song, but Elvis only read a line or two and then discarded the sheets, giving me the sense that he really knew the song, but wanted to make sure he didn't risk missing a single word. Back in the dressing room after the show, I sat on the couch near Lisa, Vernon, and Sandy, quietly watching people mingle. Roy Orbison and his wife Barbara entered the room. I was thrilled to see Roy, since I'd been a fan of his music. He was easy to spot, dressed in all black with pale skin and his trademark sunglasses. By then, Elvis had finished changing out of his jumpsuit. He entered the room, greeted his daughter, Dad, and a few others. Then he sat down beside me, and the Orbisons came over to sit across from us and talk. The room was so noisy that Elvis had to lean forward to hear them. I continued to sit quietly beside him and watch everyone. Suddenly, Elvis looked over his shoulder at me. "Would you put your hand on my back and calm me down?" he asked. I hesitated a moment. My family was close, but we rarely displayed any public affection. Even though Elvis and I had been intimate, I felt shy about casually massaging his back in public, let alone in front of a celebrity like Roy Orbison. I lightly placed my hand on his back and gently began to rub it. Elvis looked over his shoulder at me again and smiled. I was glad that the touch of my hand did seem to calm him. I wanted to please him, and seeing that small gestures like this did was helping me learn to be more openly affectionate in public. After the Orbisons left, I caught a glimpse of how truly appreciative Elvis was of his fans. He greeted 3 ladies who'd been waiting to present him with handmade figures of the 3 wise men. Each figure was beautifully crafted, and Elvis spoke with the ladies for a while, admiring the detail and workmanship that had gone into making them. These gifts would be brought up to the suite and eventually taken back to Graceland. When his second show was over and we were finally alone in the suite, Elvis was served a late meal. As he grabbed the salt shaker and began sprinkling it over his food, once again I thought this couldn't be healthy. This was confirmed when shortly after finishing his meal, he held up his left hand. "I can't believe how bloated I get," he said with a discouraged look. He then tried bending his fingers to show me how swollen they were from fluid retention. "The doctors have me take water pills before I go on stage," he continued, sounding aggravated, explaining that the pills were meant to help remove fluid from his system. "I hate to do this because those pills make me feel weak and zap some of my strength." Our relationship was still so new that it was difficult for me to feel comfortable telling him what he should or shouldn't eat. "I heard too much salt can cause fluid retention," I told him, and left it at that, hoping that over time I might be able to guide him to take a healthier approach to food. We went to bed around dawn as we usually did. The next afternoon, I woke up early and walked out onto the rooftop terrace to admire the view. I stood outside for a few minutes, feeling like a tourist, amazed by the sheer fact that I was here right now, experiencing so many new things with Elvis. Just as I was finally turning to go back inside, I was startled to see Lisa starting to climb onto a ledge behind me. She must have entered the suite and followed me outside. "Lisa, don't do that," I said as calmly as I could. As I walked her back inside, I gently explained how dangerous it could have been for her to climb on that ledge. I couldn't even imagine what Elvis would do if something happened to his only daughter. Lisa scampered off to her room. I returned to the bedroom, and seeing Elvis still asleep, decided to keep the incident from him. He had enough concerns at the time. Lisa was okay, and after our talk, I was sure she wouldn't do it again. Later that afternoon, a stout, balding man with a large cigar clenched between his teeth entered our suite. Elvis introduced him to me as his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis told me that they needed to talk some business and asked if I'd mind leaving the room. Other than a casual hello, I wouldn't see or speak much with Colonel Parker in Las Vegas. He never stayed long when he came to the suite, and he and Elvis always met in private to discuss business. That evening, Elvis injured his ankle. I was in my bathroom when it happened, but he later told me he had stepped off the platform in the bedroom and twisted it. To ease the pain and protect it, he had his ankle wrapped. He told his audience about it that night during the show. He chatted about a few other things on stage as well, including his birthday, numerology, and the significance of black diamonds. "They don't shine," he said of the diamonds. "They don't do nothing. They're just there. They're like Charlie," he joked. Uncomfortable and not wanting to injure his ankle further, he sometimes sat on a stool while performing, but still put his best effort into putting on a good show. In the suite afterward, Elvis began experiencing pain in his upper leg as well. He told me he thought he had a pinched nerve and felt that he might have pulled a hamstring muscle during a previous show. My heart went out to him. Elvis called for Dr. Guinan and Larry Geller. I could understand why Elvis wanted to see his doctor, but I was mystified about why he'd requested his hairdresser. When the two men appeared, Elvis put Larry to use by having him massage his leg. Dr. Guinan administered a shot of cortisone into the injured muscle so that Elvis would be able to perform. When we were alone again, Elvis started talking about the dry desert air. He had already mentioned it during a few shows and was worried about getting a sore throat. "I don't see how some singers can actually live and perform full-time in Las Vegas," he said. "It's essential to always protect the voice. That's why I don't usually talk loud. You should never shout or talk loud over a television so you can preserve your vocal cords as well." Elvis deeply appreciated the vocal talent of other performers, especially the beautiful voices of his backup singers, Cheryl Nielsen and Kathy Westmoreland. That night, suddenly in the mood to visit with one of them, he called Cheryl and asked him to come to our room. Elvis teased Cheryl on stage, but truly admired him, telling me, "His voice never seems to falter or crack." I could appreciate what Elvis meant. Cheryl really did shine as he played guitar and sang for us while we sat in bed. Elvis also enjoyed having conversations with his bass singer J.D. Sumner. He invited J.D. to our room occasionally and asked him to hit some of his famous low notes for me. These special moments would continue on future tours with Elvis, and I treasured them all. They were like having mini concerts right in the privacy of our own bedroom. Before going to sleep that morning, I learned that Elvis sometimes liked to be coddled. He asked me to wet a pair of cotton balls in my mouth and place one inside each of his ears. Seeing this as a little boy side to Elvis, I didn't mind doing it. This became one of the small things I was happy to do for him, like rubbing his back or soothing his eyes with a washcloth. This Las Vegas engagement was letting me get to know two different men. The first was Elvis the entertainer, who gave me a rare inside look at the intense nature of his preparation for shows, his joy and strain during performances, and what it took for him to wind down and sleep after being on stage in front of so many adoring fans. The other man was the private Elvis, with his love, passions, concerns, hurts, likes, and dislikes. He was very observant and had some pet peeves that I never would have guessed. He would get annoyed, for instance, if a person didn't look directly at him while he was talking. It also bothered Elvis whenever he noticed someone yawning while he was speaking. It's a sign of a short attention span, he told me. After that, whenever I was tired from trying to keep up with his schedule, I made sure to stifle my yawns whenever I was around him. Elvis had given me a little spending money. While Lisa was visiting, I asked if I could take her shopping, since I hadn't really had a chance to be alone with her, and he said yes. Waking early, I got Lisa and took her downstairs. She had shown a genuine fondness for shoes, and later, if mine went missing, I would find her wearing them. I decided a shoe store would be a treat for her. We entered a shoe store in the hotel, and, in the midst of me trying on a pair of pumps, I looked over and saw Lisa seated on the floor. She was surrounded by shoes she had removed from various display racks. As Lisa began trying some of them on, I walked over to her. "Lisa, these are ladies' shoes and too big for you," I said. She looked up at me and said, "That's okay. I'll grow into them." I had to laugh, because she was right. We continued on, visiting other stores in the hotel. A couple passing by stopped us at one point. "Is that Elvis's daughter?" they asked. "Yes," I said, startled. Although Lisa resembled her dad, it hadn't even entered my mind that someone could possibly recognize her, especially if she was with me. I had underestimated the keen interest of Elvis's fans. We ran into the pilot Milo soon after that, and he kindly offered to drive Lisa and me in my Continental to do some shopping outside the hotel. I knew our time was limited before Elvis woke, but I thought it would be fun to go around Las Vegas for the first time, especially my new car. Lisa and I made our way to the Hilton entrance, and in a few minutes, Milo pulled up in the Continental. Lisa climbed into the middle of the front seat. I got in beside her and shut the door, still in disbelief that this gorgeous car was actually mine. Milo drove us to the MGM Grand Hotel and waited while Lisa and I browsed inside. Carefully keeping track of time, I ended our shopping at a store that had large barrels of candy and let Lisa fill small bags with some goodies. It was nice spending time with Lisa. She was a sweet little girl, close to my niece's age, and I hoped we would become friends. Upon our return to the Hilton, Elvis was awake and, much to my surprise, displeased that we'd gone out. He didn't recall telling me that I could take Lisa. "You should never have gone out without a bodyguard," he reprimanded. I was a little hurt. I explained that I would never have taken her without his permission. This new world I'd entered into was something I definitely wasn't used to navigating. Sensing my feelings, Elvis delicately repeated, "Just next time, make sure you take a bodyguard." It dawned on me then that one of the daily fears Elvis lived with was that someone might kidnap his daughter. "I will," I said. Lisa visited off and on in the suite as often as she could in between Elvis's schedule. She stayed only a few more days, but when she flew back to Los Angeles, I was sure a large piece of Elvis's heart went right along with her. Chapter 9. Elvis liked having me with him any time he wasn't performing or discussing business. This fact, along with my shy nature, meant that other than a casual hello, I didn't talk much with the many other people who were always swirling around him. On occasion, I'd see a few women chatting together out in the living room of Elvis's suite close to showtime, but they kept their distance. In part, I think this was because I was identified as Elvis's girl, but I was also younger than most of them and inclined to keep to myself. I'm sure the other women were trying to figure out what to make of me. One of them, a friendly Hawaiian who accompanied Charlie, made an effort to speak with me. I thought she resembled Elvis's ex-wife, Priscilla. Others must have thought the same thing, because one night someone mistook this woman for Priscilla as I was accompanying her from the showroom to the ladies' room. I thought this was ironic, because a fan had mistaken me for Priscilla too, and this woman and I didn't really look alike. Overall, though, I was left pretty much on my own. I was acutely aware of having this incredible experience, but with no one around who I really knew or felt comfortable enough to share it with. I sometimes wished one of my close friends were with me. I had checked in once with my family early on, but it was impossible to describe over the phone just what I was experiencing. Elvis managed to perform his next show, despite still experiencing enough pain in his leg that he even mentioned it to the audience while he was on stage. The pain was definitely starting to interfere with his singing. At one point, he asked a couple of his backup singers to perform without him so he could rest. Back inside the penthouse that night, he summoned Larry and Charlie to our bedroom. When they arrived, Elvis told me he wanted Larry to perform a healing on his leg. I had no idea what this meant, but from that moment on, I was soon plunged into the literature and practice of both psychic healing and self-healing. Larry and Elvis were firm believers in this. I was open-minded, but my only experience had been with traditional medicine. However, being with Elvis, I would soon witness some things happen around him and start wondering if perhaps he was right, and that maybe God did instill in us the ability to heal ourselves, if we could concentrate hard enough. That night, as Elvis and Larry explained how psychic healing worked and what they were about to do, I understood why Elvis had asked for Larry's presence the previous night. As Larry explained, if a person was in pain and concentrated on a healing color in the area where the pain was, they or others could help heal the injured area or, at the very least, make the pain subside. Elvis and Larry went on to explain the correlation between colors and spiritual healing. Green was the healing color, yellow the Christ color, purple the God color, and so on. As bizarre as all this sounded to me that night, I was curious to see what would happen next. So far, with Elvis, almost anything seemed possible. Why not this too? Charlie closed the bedroom door and Larry began lighting candles, placing them in various areas around us. He then turned off the lights. In the dimly lit room, Elvis lay down on his stomach across the bed, while Charlie and I stood to one side and watched. It was exceptionally quiet. Then Larry asked each of us to imagine a golden light over Elvis's leg and to channel all of our thoughts and energy into that visualization. I understood the golden color to be a Christ color, but figured it must also be for healing. I also guessed that Larry wanted Charlie and me to be there because the more energy that was focused on healing, the better it might work. As Larry began to alternately massage or hold his hand over the muscle in the back of Elvis's leg, I focused intensely on that area. I wasn't aware of how much time passed, but whether it was just the effect of the candles or an actual phenomenon, I thought I saw a soft golden glow radiate from beneath Larry's hand. When Larry had finished, he turned the lights back on and blew out the candles. Elvis stood up, took a tentative step, and said his leg felt better. Had I just witnessed a true psychic healing? Clearly, Elvis and Larry believed so. Did I? Common sense made me question this, yet another part of me had always believed in the power of faith. I had just witnessed Elvis have pain, and now I'd heard him say, "I feel better." As unbelievable as this seemed, if this mystical type of healing had indeed given Elvis some relief, that's what mattered most to me. After Larry and Charlie left, Elvis began telling me about a breathing technique he had learned while studying martial arts. Elvis believed that, if done correctly, this technique would enable an individual to move objects without touching them, using mental energy alone. "Show me," I said. Elvis walked over to a section of the bedroom curtains and placed his palm a couple of inches away from them. He took a few deep breaths, focused on his hand, and said, "Watch." I stared at the curtains and tried to keep an open mind. Suddenly, I thought I noticed a hint of movement. I blinked. Was I really seeing the curtains move because of Elvis, or was it the result of circulating air? Elvis gave me a little smile. His knowing expression helped support my growing belief that, with Elvis, things I'd once thought were impossible might not be so far-fetched after all. A little while later, as Elvis and I were talking, he began quoting from one of his books. We had gone over them so often that I'd memorized some of the lines. Now, when he forgot part of a sentence, I was able to jump in and finish it for him. He liked that, telling me that I was a quick learner, which made me feel good. At one point, I suddenly began to feel a little queasy. Elvis noticed my discomfort and asked me to lie back on the bed. When I did, he placed his hand lightly over my abdomen and held it there, asking me to focus on the color green so he could heal me. I forced myself to lie quietly and concentrate on the color green. After a few minutes, Elvis suddenly whipped his hand high into the air, as if pulling an illness right out of my body. Miraculously, I felt less nauseous. Could Elvis really heal me? And could he teach me to heal myself? I was a bit shaken by the experience. I felt that, in order for this kind of thing to work, one had to believe in it. Maybe I was becoming a believer. Elvis had, once again, challenged me to experience something new. As the night went on, the teacher in Elvis continued to emerge. At one point, I was reading to myself with my head tilted forward off my pillow, and Elvis looked over at me. "Lift your chin and sit up straight," he suggested. "You're not getting enough oxygen." I took his advice and sat up in bed. Later, Elvis said, "You should avoid wrinkling your forehead. You should drink lots of water because it'll help prevent dark circles under your eyes." Figuring that Elvis didn't want me to look like an 80-year-old raccoon and always open to beauty suggestions, I was glad to follow his advice. Despite Larry's massages and ministrations, Elvis's leg continued to bother him. During his December 7th show, he talked about his pinched nerve and apologized to the audience, saying that he would do his best to give a good performance. Later in the show, Elvis announced that he wanted to do something he hadn't done before and sing a couple of spiritual songs that weren't normally included in his set list. With all of the reading Elvis had been doing on Eastern religions, I had yet to ask him how he felt about Jesus, or what he believed about God. But when a member of the audience shouted to Elvis, "You're the king," his answer told me a great deal. "Thank you, sir," Elvis said. "I'm fixing to sing about him." He was making it clear that, for him, there was only one king. I hadn't spoken to my family since my earlier call. Once we returned to the suite after that particular show, I felt like checking in with them. I called home and my mother answered. She sounded sleepy, and I felt bad, realizing I'd forgotten about the time difference. Even worse, my mother told me that my grandfather, Alonzo Spencer, had been taken ill a few days earlier in his nursing home in Arkansas. I loved Alonzo and had always felt close to him. He was my sole surviving grandparent. My mother was never one to worry others, but I knew her well enough to detect an uneasiness in her voice. After I hung up, I sat there staring at the phone and worrying. Did I need to go see my grandfather? I felt torn. I didn't want to leave Elvis, but what if I didn't go and something happened to Alonzo? I went back to the bedroom and told Elvis about the phone call and how I was feeling. Did your mother say anything that alarms you? He asked. No, not really, I said. I just heard something in her voice. Elvis reassured me that my grandfather would be all right, which was comforting, and said he would like me to stay. I knew he was probably right. After all, my mother hadn't said anything about me needing to see my grandfather, so I agreed. Meanwhile, Elvis said he was still feeling some pain in his leg and wanted to see Dr. Guynham. Instead of having the doctor come to the Hilton, Elvis arranged to go see him this time. I figured he probably wanted to get out for a change, and I accompanied him. Once we were in the car, however, my concern about my grandfather's health returned and gnawed away at me. I must have been extra quiet because Elvis asked what was bothering me. I'm thinking about my grandfather, I said. Elvis again tried to calm my worries. When we arrived at the physician's office, Dr. Guynham offered me a seat in the chair behind his desk while he and Elvis went into another room. I waited, hoping that Dr. Guynham could help him with his pain. After a few minutes, Dr. Guynham returned and walked up to me. Ginger, can't you see Elvis needs you? He asked. This surprised me. I'd been concerned about my grandfather, but hadn't said I was leaving. I realized with a start that Elvis must have discussed this possibility with Dr. Guynham. Before I could reply, Elvis joined us. I want to get a top doctor to help your grandfather, he told me. I'll see to it that everything possible will be done, if need be, to help him. Elvis then asked for the phone number of the nursing home. I was taken aback, despite deeply appreciating his offer. It was hard to fathom that Elvis had a need for me that was so great that, even with my grandfather's health issue, he didn't want me to leave. Dr. Guynham left the room to give us some privacy while I called my mom. She had no idea how alarmed I had become, and she gave me the number of the nursing home. As Elvis began dialing it, I wondered if whoever answered at the nursing home would really believe it was him. I was unaware at the time that the press knew of my existence and stories about me and Elvis were circulating. Word was already spreading rapidly about a possible marriage between Elvis and me. My aunts, for instance, had heard radio personality Paul Harvey announce my engagement to Elvis. The nursing home employees seemed to know about it as well. They put Elvis straight through to the head nurse administrator. Elvis talked to the administrator for a few minutes about my grandfather's care. When he hung up, he told me my grandfather had the beginning of what could be pneumonia, but they were watching him closely and he was in very good hands. Thank you, I said, and immediately felt better. Just when I thought Elvis couldn't possibly be any kinder or big-hearted, he asked me to get my mother back on the phone. I'd like to fly your family in, to give them a break, to meet me and see my shows, he said. Stunned, I redialed my home number and handed Elvis the receiver. As he spoke with my mother, Elvis told her about calling the nursing home, then said, I'd like to see to it that your father has the best possible care with the best doctor should he suddenly take a turn for the worse. Looking down, he listened silently for a few minutes. I knew my mother must be thanking him. Then Elvis interrupted her. Mrs. Alden, I'm in love with your daughter, and I want to marry her, he said. A shock rippled through my body. I straightened beside him as Elvis looked directly into my eyes, and I had to force myself to breathe. Could this really be happening? I figured someone back home at that moment must be picking my mother right up off the floor, as Elvis casually proceeded to invite my family to Las Vegas for the weekend. Then he hung up the phone with a look of total satisfaction. For my part, I was having trouble finding any words at all. Elvis may have made a remark about us being engaged earlier, but this declaration completely blew me away. Now I looked back on everything Elvis had said to me about soulmates and wondered if I'd found mine. Many of Elvis's words and his behavior had certainly intimated he had been thinking a great deal about how I might fit into his life. Now he'd mentioned marriage to my mother as if he had come to a conclusion, formulated a plan, and just wanted me to know so he could carry it out. Elvis was someone I certainly thought I could marry, but everything was happening too fast for me to process it all at once. Our time together had been so intense that I felt like I needed to slow down and catch my breath. But all I could think to do at that moment was thank him again for his kindness and generosity toward me and my family. After we'd returned to our suite from the doctor's office, Elvis began flipping through the pages of Cairo's book of numbers. Stopping on some passages dealing with our respective numbers of 4 and 8, he began examining their qualities and analyzing how they affected one another. I wondered if he knew how stunned I was feeling and was trying to prove to me that we were compatible. Or was he looking for a numerological validation of his feelings? My mind was on overdrive as he talked. How could Elvis know with such certainty, after so short a time, that I was the one for him? The next time I called home, my mother mentioned Elvis's declaration that he wanted to marry me. I could only say that I'd been as surprised as she was and that Elvis sure looked serious. "You know as much as I do," I said. Meanwhile, my mother had spoken with doctors at the nursing home and been told that my grandfather was doing okay and that he wasn't any worse. "They say it's all right for us to come see you," she said. Delighted, I relayed the news to Elvis, who immediately began arranging for my family's first visit to Las Vegas.